Chapters 55 and 56 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 55. A Hunting Ramble with Zeke. At the foot of the mountain, a steep path went up among rocks and clefts, mantled with verdure. Here and there were green gulfs, down which it made one giddy to peep. At last we gained an overhanging wooded shelf of land which crowned the heights, and along this the path, well shaded, ran like a gallery. In every direction the scenery was enchanting. There was a low, rustling breeze, and below, in the vale, the leaves were quivering. The sea lay, blue and serene, in the distance, and inland the surface swelled up, ridge after ridge, and peak upon peak, all bathed in the Indian haze of the tropics, and dreamy to look upon. Still valleys, leagues away, reposed in the deep shadows of the mountains, and here and there waterfalls lifted up their voices in the solitude. High above all, and central, the marling spike lifted its finger. Upon the hillsides small groups of bullocks were seen, some quietly browsing, others slowly winding into the valleys. We went on, directing our course for a slope of the hills a mile or two further, where the nearest bullocks were seen. We were cautious in keeping to windward of them, their sense of smell and hearing being, like those of all wild creatures, exceedingly acute. As there was no knowing that we might not surprise some other kind of game in the coverts through which we were passing, we crept along warily. The wild hogs of the island are uncommonly fierce, and as they often attack the natives, I could not help following Tonoi's example of once in a while peeping in under the foliage. Frequent retrospective glances, also, served to assure me that our retreat was not cut off. As we rounded a clump of bushes, a noise behind them, like the crackling of dry branches, broke the stillness. In an instant, Tonoi's hand was on a bough, ready for a spring, and Zeke's finger touched the trigger of his piece. Again the stillness was broken, and thinking it high time to get ready, I brought my musket to my shoulder. "Look sharp!" cried the Yankee, and dropping on one knee he brushed the twigs aside. Presently off went his piece, and with a wild snort, a black, bristling boar, his cherry-red lip curled up by two glittering tusks, dashed, unharmed, across the path, and crashed through the opposite thicket. I saluted him with a charge as he disappeared, but not the slightest notice was taken of the civility. By this time Tonoi, the illustrious descendant of the bishops of Eimeo, was 20 feet from the ground. "Aramai! Come down, you old fool!" cried the Yankee. "The pesky critter's on t'other side of the island afore this." "I rayther guess," he continued as we began reloading, "that we've spoiled sport by firing at that 'ere tarnal hog. Them bullocks heard the racket, and is flinging their tails about now on the keen jump. Quick, Paul, and let's climb that rock yonder, and see if so be there's any in sight." But none were to be seen, except at such a distance that they looked like ants. As evening was now at hand, my companion proposed our returning home forthwith, and then, after a sound night's rest, starting in the morning upon a good day's hunt with the whole force of the plantation. Following another path, in descending into the valley, we passed through some nobly wooded land on the face of the mountain. One variety of tree particularly attracted my attention. The black mossy stem, over 70 feet high, was perfectly branchless for many feet above the ground, when it shot out in broad boughs laden with lustrous leaves of the deepest green. And all round the lower part of the trunk, thin, slab-like buttresses of bark, perfectly smooth, and radiating from a common center, projected along the ground for at least 2 yards. From below, these natural props tapered upward until gradually blended with the trunk itself. There were signs of the wild cattle having sheltered themselves behind them. Zeke called this the canoe tree, as in old times it supplied the navies of the kings of Tahiti. For canoe building the wood is still used. Being extremely dense and impervious to worms, it is very durable. Emerging from the forest, when halfway down the hillside we came upon an open space, covered with ferns and grass, over which a few lonely trees were casting long shadows in the setting sun. Here a piece of ground some 100 feet square, covered with weeds and brambles, and sounding hollow to the tread, was enclosed by a ruinous wall of stones. Tonoi said it was an almost forgotten burial place of great antiquity, where no one had been interred since the islanders had been Christians. Sealed up in dry, deep vaults, many a dead heathen was lying there. Curious to prove the old man's statement, I was anxious to get a peep at the catacombs; but, hermetically overgrown with vegetation as they were, no aperture was visible. Before gaining the level of the valley, we passed by the site of a village, near a watercourse, long since deserted. There was nothing but stone walls, and rude, dismantled foundations of houses, constructed of the same material. Large trees and brushwood were growing rankly among them. I asked Tonoi how long it was since any one had lived here. "Me Tamaree (boy), plenty Kanaker (men) martair," he replied. "Now only poor Pehe Kanaka (fisherman) left. Me born here." Going down the valley, vegetation of every kind presented a different aspect from that of the high land. Chief among the trees of the plain on this island is the ati, large and lofty, with a massive trunk, and broad, laurel-shaped leaves. The wood is splendid. In Tahiti I was shown a narrow polished plank, fit to make a cabinet for a king. Taken from the heart of the tree, it was of a deep, rich scarlet, traced with yellow veins, and in some places clouded with hazel. In the same grove with the regal ati, you may see the beautiful flowering hotu, its pyramid of shining leaves diversified with numberless small, white blossoms. Planted with trees as the valley is, almost throughout its entire length, I was astonished to observe so very few which were useful to the natives. Not one in 100 was a cocoanut or breadfruit tree. But here Tonoi again enlightened me. In the sanguinary religious hostilities which ensued upon the conversion to Christianity of the first Pomaree, a war party from Tahiti destroyed, by girdling the bark, entire groves of these invaluable trees. For some time afterward, they stood stark and leafless in the sun, sad monuments of the fate which befell the inhabitants of the valley. Chapter 56. Mosquitoes. The night following the hunting trip, Long Ghost and myself, after a valiant defense, had to fly the house on account of the mosquitoes. And here I cannot avoid relating a story, rife among the natives, concerning the manner in which these insects were introduced upon the island. Some years previous, a whaling captain, touching at an adjoining bay, got into difficulty with its inhabitants, and at last carried his complaint before one of the native tribunals; but receiving no satisfaction, and deeming himself aggrieved, he resolved upon taking signal revenge. One night, he towed a rotten old water-cask ashore, and left it in a neglected taro patch, where the ground was warm and moist; hence the mosquitoes. I tried my best to learn the name of this man, and hereby do what I can to hand it down to posterity. It was Coleman, Nathan Coleman. The ship belonged to Nantucket. When tormented by the mosquitoes, I found much relief in coupling the word Coleman with another of one syllable, and pronouncing them together energetically. The doctor suggested a walk to the beach, where there was a long, low shed tumbling to pieces, but open lengthwise to a current of air which he thought might keep off the mosquitoes. So thither we went. The ruin partially sheltered a relic of times gone by, which, a few days after, we examined with much curiosity. It was an old war canoe, crumbling to dust. Being supported by the same rude blocks upon which, apparently, it had years before been hollowed out, in all probability it had never been afloat. Outside, it seemed originally stained of a green color, which, here and there, was now changed into a dingy purple. The prow terminated in a high, blunt peak. Both sides were covered with carving; and upon the stern was something which Long Ghost maintained to be the arms of the royal house of Pomaree. The device had a heraldic look, certainly, being two sharks with the talons of hawks clawing a knot left projecting from the wood. The canoe was at least 40 feet long, about 2 wide, and 4 deep. The upper part, consisting of narrow planks laced together with cords of sinnate, had in many places fallen off, and lay decaying upon the ground. Still, there were ample accommodations left for sleeping, and in we sprang, the doctor into the bow, and I into the stern. I soon fell asleep, but waking suddenly, cramped in every joint from my constrained posture, I thought for an instant that I must have been prematurely screwed down in my coffin. Presenting my compliments to Long Ghost, I asked how it fared with him. "Bad enough," he replied, as he tossed about in the outlandish rubbish lying in the bottom of our couch. "Pah! How these old mats smell!" As he continued talking in this exciting strain for some time, I at last made no reply, having resumed certain mathematical reveries to induce repose. But finding the multiplication table to no avail, I summoned up a grayish image of chaos in a sort of sliding fluidity, and was just falling into a nap on the strength of it, when I heard a solitary and distinct buzz. The hour of my calamity was at hand. One blended hum, the creature darted into the canoe like a small swordfish, and I out of it. Upon getting into the open air, to my surprise, there was Long Ghost fanning himself wildly with an old paddle. He had just made a noiseless escape from a swarm, which had attacked his own end of the canoe. It was now proposed to try the water, so a small fishing canoe, hauled up near by, was quickly launched, and paddling a good distance off, we dropped overboard the native contrivance for an anchor, a heavy stone attached to a cable of braided bark. At this part of the island, the encircling reef was close to the shore, leaving the water within smooth and extremely shallow. It was a blessed thought. We knew nothing till sunrise, when the motion of our aquatic cot awakened us. I looked up, and beheld Zeke wading toward the shore and towing us after him by the bark cable. Pointing to the reef, he told us we had had a narrow escape. It was true enough. The water sprites had rolled our stone out of its noose, and we had floated away. End of chapters 55 and 56. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 57 and 58 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas by Herman Melville. Chapter 57. The Second Hunt in the Mountains. Fair dawned over the hills of Martair the jocund morning of our hunt. Everything had been prepared for it overnight, and, when we arrived at the house, a good breakfast was spread by Shorty, and old Tonoi was bustling about like an innkeeper. Several of his men also were in attendance, to accompany us with calabashes of food, and, in case we met with any success, to officiate as bearers of burdens on our return. Apprised, the evening previous, of the meditated sport, the doctor had announced his willingness to take part therein. Now, subsequent events made us regard this expedition as a shrewd device of the Yankees. Once get us off on a pleasure trip, and with what face could we afterwards refuse to work? Besides, he enjoyed all the credit for giving us a holy day. Nor did he omit assuring us that, work or play, our wages were all the while running on. A dilapidated old musket of Tonoi's was borrowed for the doctor. It was exceedingly short and heavy, with a clumsy lock, which required a strong finger to pull the trigger. On trying the piece, by firing at a mark, Long Ghost was satisfied that it could not fail of doing execution. The charge went one way, and he the other. Upon this, he endeavored to negotiate an exchange of muskets with Shorty, but the Cockney was proof against his blandishments. At last, he entrusted his weapon to one of the natives to carry for him. Marshalling our forces, we started for the head of the valley, near which a path ascended to a range of high land, said to be a favorite resort of the cattle. Shortly after gaining the heights, A small herd, some way off, was perceived entering a wood. We hurried on, and, dividing our party, went in after them, at 4 different points, each white man followed by several natives. I soon found myself in a dense covert, and after looking round, was just emerging into a clear space, when I heard a report, and a bullet knocked the bark from a tree near by. The same instant there was a trampling and crashing, and 5 bullocks, nearly abreast, broke into view across the opening, and plunged right towards the spot where myself and 3 of the islanders were standing. They were small, black, vicious-looking creatures, with short, sharp horns, red nostrils, and eyes like coals of fire. On they came, their dark woolly heads hanging down. By this time my island backers were roosting among the trees. Glancing round for an instant, to discover a retreat in case of emergency, I raised my piece, when a voice cried out from the wood, "Right between the 'orns, Paul! Right between the 'orns!" Down went my barrel, in range with a small white tuft on the forehead of the headmost one, and letting him have it, I darted to one side. As I turned again, the 5 bullocks shot by like a blast, making the air eddy in their wake. The Yankee now burst into view and saluted them in flank, whereupon the fierce little bull with the tufted forehead flirted his long tail over his buttocks, kicked out with his hind feet, and shot forward at full length. It was nothing but a graze, and in an instant they were out of sight, the thicket into which they broke rocking overhead and marking their progress. The action over, the heavy artillery came up, in the person of the long doctor with his blunderbuss. "Where are they?" he cried, out of breath. "A mile or 2 hoff, by this time," replied the Cockney. "Lord, Paul, you ought to have sent an 'ailstone into that little black 'un." While excusing my want of skill as well as I could, Zeke, rushing forward, suddenly exclaimed, "Creation! What are you 'bout there, Peter?" Peter, incensed at our ill luck, and ignorantly imputing it to the cowardice of our native auxiliaries, was bringing his piece to bear upon his trembling squire, the musket-carrier, now descending a tree. Pulling trigger, the bullet went high over his head, and hopping to the ground, bellowing like a calf, the fellow ran away as fast as his heels could carry him. The rest followed us, after this, with fear and trembling. After forming our line of march anew, we went on for several hours without catching a glimpse of the game, the reports of the muskets having been heard at a great distance. At last we mounted a craggy height, to obtain a wide view of the country. From this place we beheld 3 cattle quietly browsing in a green opening of a wood below, the trees shutting them in all round. A general re-examination of the muskets now took place, followed by a hasty lunch from the calabashes. We then started. As we descended the mountainside, the cattle were in plain sight until we entered the forest, when we lost sight of them for a moment, but only to see them again as we crept close up to the spot where they grazed. They were a bull, a cow, and a calf. The cow was lying down in the shade by the edge of the wood, the calf sprawling out before her in the grass, licking her lips, while old Taurus himself stood close by, casting a paternal glance at this domestic little scene, and conjugally elevating his nose in the air. "Now then," said Zeke in a whisper, "let's take the poor creeturs while they are huddled together. Crawl along, boys, crawl along. Fire together, mind, and not till I say the word." We crept up to the very edge of the open ground, and knelt behind a clump of bushes, resting our leveled barrels among the branches. The slight rustling was heard. Taurus turned round, dropped his head to the ground, and sent forth a low, sullen bellow, then snuffed the air. The cow rose on her foreknees, pitched forward alarmedly, and stood upon her legs, while the calf, with ears pricked, got right underneath her. All 3 were now grouped, and in an instant would be off. "I take the bull!" cried our leader. "Fire!" The calf fell like a clod. Its dam uttered a cry and thrust her head into the thicket, but she turned, and came moaning up to the lifeless calf, going round and round it, snuffing fiercely with her bleeding nostrils. A crashing in the wood and a loud roar announced the flying bull. Soon another shot was fired and the cow fell. Leaving some of the natives to look after the dead cattle, the rest of us hurried on after the bull, his dreadful bellowings guiding us to the spot where he lay. Wounded in the shoulder, in his fright and agony he had bounded into the wood. But when we came up to him, he had sunk to the earth in a green hollow, thrusting his black muzzle into a pool of his own blood and tossing it over his hide in clots. The Yankee brought his piece to a rest, and, the next instant, the wild brute sprang into the air, and with his forelegs crouching under him, fell dead. Our island friends were now in high spirits, all courage and alacrity. Old Tonoi thought nothing of taking poor Taurus himself by the horns and peering into his glazed eyes. Our ship knives were at once in request, and, skinning the cattle, we hung them high up by cords of bark from the boughs of a tree. Withdrawing into a covert, we there waited for the wild hogs, which, according to Zeke, would soon make their appearance, lured by the smell of blood. Presently we heard them coming in 2 or 3 different directions, and, in a moment, they were tearing the offal to pieces. As only one shot at these creatures could be relied on, we intended firing simultaneously, but somehow or other the doctor's piece went off by itself, and one of the hogs dropped. The others then breaking into the thicket, the rest of us sprang after them, resolved to have another shot at all hazards. The Cockney darted among some bushes, and a few moments after we heard the report of his musket, followed by a quick cry. On running up, we saw our comrade doing battle with a young devil of a boar, as black as night, whose snout had been partly torn away. Firing when the game was in full career, and coming directly toward him, Shorty had been assailed by the enraged brute. It was now crunching the breech of the musket, with which he had tried to club it. Shorty holding fast to the barrel and fingering his waist for a knife. Being in advance of the others, I clapped my gun to the boar's head, and so put an end to the contest. Evening now coming on, we set to work loading our carriers. The cattle were so small that a stout native could walk off with an entire quarter, brushing through thickets and descending rocks without apparent effort, though, to tell the truth, no white man present could have done the thing with any ease. As for the wild hogs, none of the islanders could be induced to carry Shorty's, some invincible superstition being connected with its black color. We were, therefore, obliged to leave it. The other, a spotted one, being slung by green thongs to a pole, was marched off with by 2 young natives. With our bearers of burdens ahead, we then commenced our return down the valley. Halfway home, darkness overtook us in the woods, and torches became necessary. We stopped and made them of dry palm branches, and then, sending 2 lads on in advance, for the purpose of gathering fuel to feed the flambeaux, we continued our journey. It was a wild sight. The torches, waved aloft, flashed through the forest, and where the ground admitted, the islanders went along at a brisk trot, notwithstanding they bent forward under their loads. Their naked backs were stained with blood, and occasionally, running by each other, they raised wild cries, which startled the hillsides. Chapter 58. The Hunting Feast, and a Visit to Afrihitu. 2 bullocks and a boar! No bad trophies of our day's sport. So by torchlight we marched into the plantation, the wild hog rocking from its pole, and the doctor singing an old hunting song, Tally-ho, the chorus of which swelled high above the yells of the natives. We resolved to make a night of it. Kindling a great fire just outside the dwelling, and hanging one of the heifer's quarters from a limb of the banyan tree, every one was at liberty to cut and broil for himself. Baskets of roasted breadfruit and plenty of taro pudding, bunches of bananas and young coconuts had also been provided by the natives against our return. The fire burned bravely, keeping off the mosquitoes, and making every man's face glow like a beaker of port. The meat had a true wild game flavor, not at all impaired by our famous appetites, and a couple of flasks of white brandy, which Zeke, producing from his secret store, circulated freely. There was no end to my long comrade's spirits. After telling his stories and singing his songs, he sprang to his feet, clasped a young damsel of the grove round the waist, and waltzed over the grass with her. But there's no telling all the pranks he played that night. The natives, who delight in a wag, emphatically pronounced him Mai Tai. It was long after midnight ere we broke up; but when the rest had retired, Zeke, with the true thrift of a Yankee, salted down what was left of the meat. The next day was Sunday, and, at my request, Shorty accompanied me to Afrahitu, a neighboring bay, and the seat of a mission, almost directly opposite Papeetee. In Afrahitu is a large church and schoolhouse, both quite dilapidated, and planted amid shrubbery on a fine knoll stands a very tasteful cottage, commanding a view across the channel. In passing, I caught sight of a graceful calico skirt disappearing from the piazza through a doorway. The place was the residence of the missionary. A trim little sailboat was dancing out at her moorings a few yards from the beach. Straggling over the low lands in the vicinity were several native huts, untidy enough, but much better every way than most of those in Tahiti. We attended service at the church, where we found but a small congregation; and after what I had seen in Papeetee, nothing very interesting took place. But the audience had a curious, fidgety look, which I knew not how to account for, until we ascertained that a sermon with the 8th commandment for a text was being preached. It seemed that there lived an Englishman in the district, who, like our friends the planters, was cultivating Tombay's potatoes for the Papeetee market. In spite of all his precautions, the natives were in the habit of making nocturnal forays into his enclosure, and carrying off the potatoes. One night he fired a fowling piece, charged with pepper and salt, at several shadows which he discovered stealing across his premises. They fled; but it was like seasoning anything else. The knaves stole again with a greater relish than ever, and the very next night he caught a party in the act of roasting a basketful of potatoes under his own cooking shed. At last, he stated his grievances to the missionary, who, for the benefit of his congregation, preached the sermon we heard. Now, there were no thieves in Martair, but then the people of the valley were bribed to be honest. It was a regular business transaction between them and the planters. In consideration of so many potatoes, to them in hand, duly paid, they were to abstain from all depredations upon the plantation. Another security against roguery was the permanent residence upon the premises of their chief, Tonoi. On our return to Martair, in the afternoon, we found the doctor and Zeke making themselves comfortable. The latter was reclining on the ground, pipe in mouth, watching the doctor, who, sitting like a Turk before a large iron kettle, was slicing potatoes and Indian turnip, and now and then shattering splinters from a bone, all of which by turns were thrown into the pot. He was making what he called bullock broth. In gastronomic affairs, my friend was something of an artist; and, by way of improving his knowledge, did nothing the rest of the day but practice in what might be called experimental cookery, broiling and grilling and deviling slices of meat, and subjecting them to all sorts of igneous operations. It was the first fresh beef that either of us had tasted in more than a year. "Oh, ye'll pick up arter a while, Peter," observed Zeke toward night, as Long Ghost was turning a great rib over the coals. "What d'ye think, Paul?" "He'll get along, I dare say," replied I. "He only wants to get those cheeks of his tanned." To tell the truth, I was not a little pleased to see the doctor's reputation as an invalid fading away so fast; especially as on the strength of his being one, he had promised to have such easy times of it, and very likely, too, at my expense. End of chapters 57 and 58. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 59 and 60 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 59. The Murphys. Dozing in our canoe the next morning about daybreak, we were wakened by Zeke's hailing us loudly from the beach. Upon paddling up, he told us that a canoe had arrived overnight from Papeetee with an order from a ship lying there for a supply of his potatoes, and as they must be on board the vessel by noon, he wanted us to assist in bringing them down to his sailboat. My long comrade was one of those who, from always thrusting forth the wrong foot foremost when they rise, or committing some other indiscretion of the limbs, are more or less crabbed or sullen before breakfast. It was in vain, therefore, that the Yankee deplored the urgency of the case, which obliged him to call us up thus early. The doctor only looked the more glum, and said nothing in reply. At last, by way of getting up a little enthusiasm for the occasion, the Yankee exclaimed quite spiritedly, "What do ye say then, boys? Shall we get at it?" "Yes, in the devil's name," replied the doctor, like a snapping turtle, and we moved on to the house. Notwithstanding his ungracious answer, he probably thought that after the gastronomic performance of the day previous, it would hardly do to hang back. At the house we found Shorty ready with the hose, and we at once repaired to the farther side of the enclosure where the potatoes had yet to be taken out of the ground. The rich, tawny soil seemed specially adapted to the crop, the great yellow murphies rolling out of the hills like eggs from a nest. My comrade really surprised me by the zeal with which he applied himself to his hoe. For my own part, exhilarated by the cool breath of the morning, I worked away like a good fellow. As for Zeke and the Cockney, they seemed mightily pleased at this evidence of our willingness to exert ourselves. It was not long ere all the potatoes were turned out, and then came the worst of it. They were to be lugged down to the beach, a distance of at least 1/4 of a mile, and there being no such thing as a barrow or cart on the island, there was nothing for it but spinal marrows and broad shoulders. Well knowing that this part of the business would be anything but agreeable, Zeke did his best to put as encouraging a face upon it as possible, and giving us no time to indulge in desponding thoughts, gleefully directed our attention to a pile of rude baskets, made of stout stalks, which had been provided for the occasion. So, without more ado, we helped ourselves from the heap, and soon we were all four staggering along under our loads. The first trip down, we arrived at the beach together, Zeke's enthusiastic cries proving irresistible. A trip or two more, however, and my shoulders began to grate in their sockets, while the doctor's tall figure acquired an obvious stoop. Presently we both threw down our baskets, protesting we could stand it no longer. But our employers, bent as it were upon getting the work out of us by a silent appeal to our moral sense, toiled away without pretending to notice us. It was as much to say, "There, men, we've been boarding and lodging ye for the last 3 days, and yesterday ye did nothing earthly but eat. So stand by now, and look at us working, if ye dare." Thus driven to it, then, we resumed our employment. Yet, in spite of all we could do, we lagged behind Zeke and Shorty, who, breathing hard, and perspiring at every pore, toiled away without pause or cessation. I almost wickedly wished that they would load themselves down with one potato too many. Gasping as I was with my own hamper, I could not, for the life of me, help laughing at Long Ghost. There he went, his long neck thrust forward, his arms twisted behind him to form a shelf for his basket to rest on, and his stilts of legs every once in a while giving way under him, as if his knee joints slipped either way. "There, I carry no more," he exclaimed all at once, flinging his potatoes into the boat, where the Yankee was just then stowing them away. "Oh, then," said Zeke, quite briskly, "I guess you and Paul had better try the barrel machine. Come along, I'll fix ye out in no time." And so saying, he waded ashore, and hurried back to the house, bidding us follow. Wondering what upon earth the barrel machine could be, and rather suspicious of it, we limped after. On arriving at the house, we found him getting ready a sort of sedan chair. It was nothing more than an old barrel, suspended by a rope from the middle of a stout oar. Quite an ingenious contrivance of the Yankees, and his proposed arrangement with regard to mine and the doctor's shoulders was equally so. "There now," said he, when everything was ready, "there's no back-breaking about this. You can stand right up under it, you see. Just try it once." And he politely rested the blade of the oar on my comrade's right shoulder and the other end on mine, leaving the barrel between us. "Just the thing," he added, standing off admiringly, while we remained in this interesting attitude. There was no help for us. With broken hearts and backs we trudged back to the field, the doctor all the while saying masses. Upon starting with the loaded barrel, for a few paces we got along pretty well, and were constrained to think the idea not a bad one. But we did not long think so. In less than 5 minutes we came to a dead halt, the springing and buckling of the clumsy oar being almost unendurable. "Let's shift ends," cried the doctor, who did not quite relish the blade of the stick which was cutting into the blade of his shoulder. At last, by stages short and frequent, we managed to shamble down to the beach, where we again dumped our cargo in something of a pet. "Why not make the natives help?" asked Long Ghost, rubbing his shoulder. "Natives be dummed," said the Yankee. 20 on 'em ain't worth one white man. They never was meant to work any, them chaps, and they knows it too, for dummed little work any on 'em ever does." But notwithstanding this abuse, Zeke was at last obliged to press a few of the bipeds into service. "Aramai! Come here!" he shouted to several, who, reclining on a bank, had hitherto been critical observers of our proceedings, and, among other things, had been particularly amused by the performance with the sedan chair. After making these fellows load their baskets together, the Yankee filled his own, and then drove them before him down to the beach. Probably he had seen the herds of panniard mules, driven in this way by mounted Indians, along the great road from Callao to Lima. The boat at last loaded, the Yankee taking with him a couple of natives, at once hoisted sail and stood across the channel for Papeete. The next morning at breakfast old Tonoi ran in and told us that the voyageurs were returning. We hurried down to the beach, and saw the boat gliding toward us, with a dozing islander at the helm, and Zeke standing up in the bows, jingling a small bag of silver, the proceeds of his cargo. Chapter 60. What they thought of us in Martair. Several quiet days now passed away, during which we just worked sufficiently to sharpen our appetites, the planters leniently exempting us from any severe toil. Their desire to retain us became more and more evident, which was not to be wondered at; for, beside esteeming us from the beginning a couple of civil, good-natured fellows, who would soon become quite at home with them, they were not slow in perceiving that we were far different from the common run of rovers, and that our society was both entertaining and instructive to a couple of solitary, illiterate men like themselves. In a literary point of view, indeed, they soon regarded us with emotions of envy and wonder, and the doctor was considered nothing short of a prodigy. The Cockney found out that he, the doctor, could read a book upside down, without even so much as spelling the big words beforehand, and the Yankee, in the twinkling of an eye, received from him the sum total of several arithmetical items, stated aloud, with the view of testing the extent of his mathematical lore. Then, frequently, in discoursing upon men and things, my long comrade employed such imposing phrases, that, upon one occasion, they actually remained uncovered while he talked. In short, their favorable opinion of Long Ghost in particular rose higher and higher every day, and they began to indulge in all manner of dreams concerning the advantages to be derived from employing so learned a laborer. Among other projects revealed was that of building a small craft of some 40 tons, for the purpose of trading among the neighboring islands. With a native crew, we could then take turns cruising over the tranquil Pacific, touching here and there as caprice suggested, and collecting romantic articles of commerce: biche de mer, the pearl oyster, arrowroot, ambergris, sandalwood, cocoanut oil, and edible birds' nests. This South Sea yachting was delightful to think of, and straightway the doctor announced his willingness to navigate the future schooner clear of all shoals and reefs whatsoever. His impudence was audacious. He enlarged upon the science of navigation, treated us to a dissertation on Mercator's sailing and the azimuth compass, and went into an inexplicable explanation of the Lord only knows what plan of his for infallibly settling the longitude. Whenever my comrade thus gave reins to his fine fancy, it was a treat to listen, and therefore I never interfered, but, with the planters, sat in mute admiration before him. This apparent self-abasement on my part must have been considered as truly indicative of our respective merits; for, to my no small concern, I quickly perceived that in the estimate formed of us, Long Ghost began to be rated far above myself. For aught I knew indeed, he might have privately thrown out a hint concerning the difference in our respective stations aboard the Julia; or else, the planters must have considered him some illustrious individual, for certain inscrutable reasons, going incognito. With this idea of him, his undisguised disinclination for work became venial, and, entertaining such views of extending their business, they counted more upon his ultimate value to them as a man of science than as a mere ditcher. Nor did the humorous doctor forbear to foster an opinion every way so advantageous to himself; at times, for the sake of the joke, assuming airs of superiority over myself, which, though laughable enough, were sometimes annoying. To tell the plain truth, things at last came to such a pass that I told him up and down that I had no notion to put up with his pretensions. If he were going to play the gentleman, I was going to follow suit, and then there would quickly be an explosion. At this he laughed heartily, and after some mirthful chat, we resolved upon leaving the valley as soon as we could do so with a proper regard to politeness. At supper, therefore, the same evening, the doctor hinted at our intention. Though much surprised and vexed, Zeke moved not a muscle. "Peter," he said at last, very gravely, and after mature deliberation, "would you like to do the cooking? It's easy work, and you needn't do anything else. Paul's heartier. He can work in the field when it suits him; and before long we'll have ye at something more agreeable. Won't we, Shorty?" Shorty assented. Doubtless the proposed arrangement was a snug one, especially the sinecure for the doctor; but I by no means relished the functions allotted to myself; they were too indefinite. Nothing final, however, was agreed upon. Our intention to leave was revealed, and that was enough for the present. But, as we said nothing further about going, the Yankee must have concluded that we might yet be induced to remain. He redoubled his endeavours to make us contented. It was during this state of affairs that one morning, before breakfast, we were set to weeding in a potato patch, and the planters being engaged at the house, we were left to ourselves. Now, though the pulling of weeds was considered by our employers an easy occupation, for which reason they had assigned it to us, and although, as a garden recreation, it may be pleasant enough for those who like it, still, long persisted in, the business becomes excessively irksome. Nevertheless, we toiled away for some time, until the doctor, who, from his height, was obliged to stoop at a very acute angle, suddenly sprang upright, and with one hand propping his spinal column, exclaimed, "Oh, that one's joints were but provided with holes to drop a little oil through!" Vain as the aspiration was for this proposed improvement upon our species, I cordially responded thereto, for every vertebra in my spine was articulating its sympathy. Presently the sun rose over the mountains, inducing that deadly morning languor so fatal to early exertion in a warm climate. We could stand it no longer, but, shouldering our hoes, moved on to the house, resolved to impose no more upon the good nature of the planters by continuing one moment longer in an occupation so extremely uncongenial. We freely told them so. Zeke was exceedingly hurt, and said everything he could think of to alter our determination; but, finding all unavailing, He very hospitably urged us not to be in any hurry about leaving, for we might stay with him as guests until we had time to decide upon our future movements. We thanked him sincerely, but replied that the following morning we must turn our backs upon the hills of Martair. End of chapters 59 and 60. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 61 and 62 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas by Herman Melville. Chapter 61. Preparing for the Journey. During the remainder of the day, we loitered about, talking over our plans. The doctor was all eagerness to visit Tamai, a solitary inland village, standing upon the banks of a considerable lake of the same name, and embosomed among groves. From Afrehitu, you went to this place by a lonely pathway, leading through the wildest scenery in the world. Much, too, we had heard concerning the lake itself, which abounded in such delicious fish that, in former times, angling parties occasionally came over to it from Papeete. Upon its banks, moreover, grew the finest fruit of the islands, and in their greatest perfection. The vey, or Brazilian plum, here attained the size of an orange, and the gorgeous arhia, or red apple of Tahiti, blushed with deeper dyes than in any of the seaward valleys. Beside all this, in Tamai dwelt the most beautiful and unsophisticated women in the entire society group. In short, the village was so remote from the coast, and had been so much less affected by recent changes than other places, that, in most things, Tahitian life was here seen as formerly existing in the days of young Otoo, the boy-king, in Cook's time. After obtaining from the planters all the information which was needed, we decided upon penetrating to the village, and after a temporary sojourn there, to strike the beach again, and journey round to Taloo, a harbor on the opposite side of the island. We at once put ourselves in traveling trim. Just previous to leaving Tahiti, having found my wardrobe reduced to 2 suits, frock and trousers, both much the worse for wear, I had quilted them together for mutual preservation, after a fashion peculiar to sailors, engrafting a red frock upon a blue one, and producing thereby a choice variety in the way of clothing. This was the extent of my wardrobe. Nor was the doctor by any means better off. His improvidence had at last driven him to don the nautical garb, but by this time his frock, a light cotton one, had almost given out, and he had nothing to replace it. Shorty very generously offered him one which was a little less ragged, but the alms was proudly refused, Long Ghost preferring to assume the ancient costume of Tahiti, the rura. This garment, once worn as a festival dress, is now seldom met with, but Captain Bob had often shown us one which he kept as an heirloom. It was a cloak or mantle of yellow tappa, precisely similar to the poncho worn by the South American Spaniards. The head being slipped through a slit in the middle, the robe hangs about the person in ample drapery. Tonoi obtained sufficient coarse brown tappa to make a short mantle of this description, and in 5 minutes the doctor was equipped. Zeke, eyeing his toga, critically reminded its proprietor that there were many streams to ford, and precipices to scale, between Martair and Tamai, and if he traveled in petticoats, he had better hold them up. Besides other deficiencies, we were utterly shoeless. In the free and easy Pacific, sailors seldom wear shoes. Mine had been tossed overboard the day we met the trades, and except in 1 or 2 tramps ashore, I had never worn any since. In Martair they would have been desirable, but none were to be had. For the expedition we meditated, however, they were indispensable. Zeke, being the owner of a pair of huge, dilapidated boots, hanging from a rafter-like saddlebags, the doctor succeeded in exchanging for them a case-knife, the last valuable article in his possession. For myself, I made sandals from a bullock's hide, such as are worn by the Indians in California. They are made in a minute, the sole, rudely fashioned to the foot, being confined across the instep by 3 straps of leather. Our headgear deserves a passing word. My comrade's was a brave old Panama hat made of grass, almost as fine as threads of silk, and so elastic that, upon rolling it up, it sprang into perfect shape again. Set off by the jaunty slouch of this Spanish sombrero, Dr. Longghost, in this and his rura, looked like a mendicant grandee. Nor was my own appearance in an Eastern turban less distinguished. The way I came to wear it was this. My hat having been knocked overboard a few days before reaching Papeete, I was obliged to mount an abominable wad of parti-coloured worsted, what sailors call a Scotch cap. Every one knows the elasticity of knit wool, and this Caledonian headdress crowned my temples so effectually that the confined atmosphere engendered was prejudicial to my curls. In vain I tried to ventilate the cap. Every gash made seemed to heal whole in no time. Then such a continual chafing as it kept up in a hot sun. Seeing my dislike to the thing, Kooloo, my worthy friend, prevailed upon me to bestow it upon him. I did so, hinting that a good boiling might restore the original brilliancy of the colours. It was then that I mounted the turban. Taking a new regatta frock of the doctor's, which was of a gay calico, and winding it round my head in folds, I allowed the sleeves to droop behind, thus forming a good defence against the sun, though in a shower it was best off. The pendant sleeves adding much to the effect, the doctor always called me the Bashaw with 2 tails. Thus arrayed, we were ready for Tamai, in whose green saloons we counted upon creating no small sensation. Chapter 62. Tamai. Long before sunrise the next morning, my sandals were laced on, and the doctor had vaulted into Zeke's boots. Expecting to see us again before we went to Taloo, the planters wished us a pleasant journey, and on parting, very generously presented us with a pound or 2 of what sailors call plug tobacco, telling us to cut it up into small change, the Virginian weed being the principal circulating medium on the island. Tamai, we are told, was not more than 3 or 4 leagues distant; so making allowances for a wild road, a few hours to rest at noon, and our determination to take the journey leisurely, we counted upon reaching the shores of the lake some time in the flush of the evening. For several hours we went on slowly through wood and ravine, and over hill and precipice, seeing nothing but occasional herds of wild cattle, and often resting, until we found ourselves about noon in the very heart of the island. It was a green, cool hollow among the mountains, into which we at last descended with a bound. The place was gushing with 100 springs, and shaded over with great solemn trees, on whose mossy boles the moisture stood in beads. Strange to say, no traces of the bullocks ever having been here were revealed; nor was there a sound to be heard, nor a bird to be seen, nor any breath of wind stirring the leaves. The utter solitude and silence were oppressive; and after peering about under the shades, and seeing nothing but ranks of dark, motionless trunks, we hurried across the hollow, and ascended a steep mountain opposite. Midway up, we rested where the earth had gathered about the roots of 3 palms, and thus formed a pleasant lounge, from which we looked down upon the hollow, now one dark green tuft of woodland at our feet. Here we brought forth a small calabash of poee, a parting present from Tonoi. After eating heartily, we obtained fire by 2 sticks, and throwing ourselves back, puffed forth our fatigue in wreaths of smoke. At last we fell asleep; nor did we waken till the sun had sunk so low that its rays darted in upon us under the foliage. Starting up, we then continued our journey, and as we gained the mountain top, there, to our surprise, lay the lake and village of Tamai. We had thought it a good league off. Where we stood, the yellow sunset was still lingering, but over the valley below long shadows were stealing, the rippling green lake reflecting the houses and trees just as they stood along its banks. Several small canoes, moored here and there to posts in the water, were dancing upon the waves, and one solitary fisherman was paddling over to a grassy point. In front of the houses, groups of natives were seen, some thrown at full length upon the ground, and others indolently leaning against the bamboos. With whoop and halloo we ran down the hills, the villagers soon hurrying forth to see who were coming. As we drew near, they gathered round, all curiosity to know what brought the Karhowrees into their quiet country. The doctor contriving to make them understand the purely social object of our visit, they gave us a true Tahitian welcome, pointing into their dwellings, and saying they were ours as long as we chose to remain. We were struck by the appearance of these people, both men and women, so much more healthful than the inhabitants of the bays. As for the young girls, they were more retiring and modest, more tidy in their dress, and far fresher and more beautiful than the damsels of the coast. 1,000 pities, thought I, that they should bury their charms in this nook of a valley. That night we abode in the house of Rartu, a hospitable old chief. It was right on the shore of the lake, and at supper we looked out through a rustling screen of foliage upon the surface of the starlit water. The next day we rambled about and found a happy little community, comparatively free from many deplorable evils to which the rest of their countrymen were subject. Their time, too, was more occupied. To my surprise, the manufacture of tappa was going on in several buildings. European calicoes were seldom seen, and not many articles of foreign origin of any description. The people of Tamai were nominally Christians, but being so remote from ecclesiastical jurisdiction, their religion sat lightly upon them. We had been told, even, that many heathenish games and dances still secretly lingered in their valley. Now the prospect of seeing an old-fashioned hevar, or Tahitian reel, was one of the inducements which brought us here; and so, finding Rartu rather liberal in his religious ideas, we disclosed our desire. At first he demurred, and shrugging his shoulders like a Frenchman, declared it could not be brought about, was a dangerous matter to attempt, and might bring all concerned into trouble. But we overcame all this, convinced him that the thing could be done, and a hevar, a genuine pagan fandango, was arranged for that very night. End of chapters 61 and 62. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 63 and 64 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 63. A Dance in the Valley. There were some ill-natured people, tell-tales, it seemed, in Tamai, and hence there was a deal of mystery about getting up the dance. An hour or two before midnight, Rartu entered the house, and, throwing robes of tappa over us, bade us follow at a distance behind him, and, until out of the village, hood our faces. Keenly alive to the adventure, we obeyed. At last, after taking a wide circuit, we came out upon the farthest shore of the lake. It was a wide, dewy space, lighted up by a full moon, and carpeted with a minute species of fern, growing closely together. It swept right down to the water, showing the village opposite, glistening among the groves. Near the trees, on one side of the clear space, was a ruinous pile of stones, many rods in extent, upon which had formerly stood a temple of Oro. At present there was nothing but a rude hut, planted on the lowermost terrace. It seemed to have been used as a tappa harry, or house for making the native cloth. Here we saw lights gleaming from between the bamboos, and casting long, rod-like shadows upon the ground without. Voices were also heard. We went up, and had a peep at the dancers, who were getting ready for the ballet. They were some 20 in number, waited upon by hideous old crones, who might have been duennas. Long Ghost proposed to send the latter packing, but Rartu said it would never do, and so they were permitted to remain. We tried to effect an entrance at the door, which was fastened, but after a noisy discussion with one of the old witches within, our guide became fidgety, and, at last, told us to desist, or we would spoil all. He then led us off to a distance to await the performance, as the girls, he said, did not wish to be recognized. He, furthermore, made us promise to remain where we were until all was over and the dancers had retired. We waited impatiently, and at last they came forth. They were arrayed in short tunics of white tapa, with garlands of flowers on their heads. Following them were the duennas, who remained clustering about the house, while the girls advanced a few paces. And, in an instant, two of them, taller than their companions, were standing side by side, in the middle of a ring formed by the clasped hands of the rest. This movement was made in perfect silence. Presently the two girls join hands overhead, and crying out, "Ahlu! Ahlu!" wave them to and fro; upon which the ring begins to circle slowly, the dancers moving sideways, with their arms a little drooping. Soon they quicken their pace, and at last fly round and round, bosoms heaving, hair streaming, flowers dropping, and every sparkling eye circling in what seemed a line of light. Meanwhile, the pair within were passing and repassing each other incessantly. Inclining sideways, so that their long hair falls far over, they glide this way and that, one foot continually in the air, and their fingers thrown forth and twirling in the moonbeams. "Ahlu! Ahlu!" again cry the dance queens, and coming together in the middle of the ring, they once more lift up the arch and stand motionless. "Ahlu! Ahlu!" Every link of the circle is broken, and the girls, deeply breathing, stand perfectly still. They pant hard and fast a moment or two, and then, just as the deep flush is dying away from their faces, slowly recede all round, thus enlarging the ring. Again the two leaders wave their hands when the rest pause, and now, far apart, stand in the still moonlight, like a circle of fairies. Presently, raising a strange chant, they softly sway themselves, gradually quickening the movement, until at length, for a few passionate moments, with throbbing bosoms and glowing cheeks, they abandon themselves to all the spirit of the dance, apparently lost to everything round; but soon subsiding again into the same languid measure as before, they become motionless, and then, reeling forward on all sides, their eyes swimming in their heads, join in one wild chorus and sink into each other's arms. Such is the Lori Lori, I think they call it, the dance of the backsliding girls of Tamai. While it was going on, we had as much as we could do to keep the doctor from rushing forward and seizing a partner. They would give us no more hevars that night, and Rartu fairly dragged us away to a canoe hauled up on the lake shore, when we reluctantly embarked, and paddling over to the village, arrived there in time for a good nap before sunrise. The next day the doctor went about trying to hunt up the overnight dancers. He thought to detect them by their late rising, but never was man more mistaken, for, on first sallying out, the whole village was asleep, waking up in concert about an hour after. But in the course of the day he came across several, whom he at once charged with taking part in the hevar. There were some prim-looking fellows standing by, visiting elders from Afrahitu perhaps, and the girls looked embarrassed, but parried the exchange most skillfully. Though soft as doves, in general, the ladies of Tamai are, nevertheless, flavored with a slight tincture of what we queerly enough call the devil, and they showed it on the present occasion, for when the doctor pressed one rather hard, she all at once turned round upon him, and giving him a box on the ear, told him to "Hanri Parar," be off with himself. Chapter 64. Mysterious. There was a little old man of a most hideous aspect living in Tamai, who, in a coarse mantle of tapa, went about the village, dancing and singing and making faces. He followed us about wherever we went, and, when unobserved by others, plucked at our garments, making frightful signs for us to go along with him somewhere and see something. It was in vain that we tried to get rid of him. Kicks and cuffs, even, were at last resorted to, but, though he howled like one possessed, he would not go away, but still haunted us. At last we conjured the natives to rid us of him, but they only laughed, so we were forced to endure the dispensation as well as we could. On the fourth night of our visit, returning home late from paying a few calls through the village, we turned a dark corner of trees, and came full upon our goblin friend. as usual, chattering and motioning with his hands. The doctor, venting a curse, hurried forward. But, from some impulse or other, I stood my ground, resolved to find out what this unaccountable object wanted of us. Seeing me pause, he crept close up to me, peered into my face, and then retreated, beckoning me to follow, which I did. In a few moments the village was behind us, and with my guide in advance, I found myself in the shadow of the heights overlooking the farther side of the valley. Here my guide paused until I came up with him, when, side by side, and without speaking, we ascended the hill. Presently we came to a wretched hut, barely distinguishable in the shade cast by the neighboring trees. Pushing aside a rude, sliding door, held together with thongs, the goblin signed me to enter. Within, it looked dark as pitch, so I gave him to understand that he must strike a light, and go in before me. Without replying, he disappeared in the darkness, and after groping about, I heard two sticks rubbing together, and directly saw a spark. A native taper was then lighted, and I stooped and entered. It was a mere kennel. Foul old mats, and broken cocoanut shells, and calabashes were strewn about the floor of earth, and overhead I caught glimpses of the stars through chinks in the roof. Here and there the thatch had fallen through, and hung down in wisps. I now told him to set about what he was going to do, or produce whatever he had to show, without delay. Looking round fearfully, as if dreading a surprise, he commenced turning over and over the rubbish in one corner. At last he clutched a calabash, stained black, and with a neck broken off. On one side of it was a large hole. Something seemed to be stuffed away in the vessel, and after a deal of poking at the aperture, a musty old pair of sailor trousers was drawn forth, and holding them up eagerly, he inquired how many pieces of tobacco I would give for them. Without replying, I turned away, the old man chasing me and shouting as I ran, until I gained the village. Here I dodged him, and made my way home, resolved never to disclose so inglorious an adventure. To no purpose, the next morning, my comrade besought me to enlighten him. I preserved a mysterious silence. The occurrence served me a good turn, however, so long as we abode in Tamai, for the old clothes man never afterward troubled me, but forever haunted the doctor, who, in vain, supplicated heaven to be delivered from him. End of chapters 63 and 64. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 65 and 66 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 65. The Hegira, or Flight. "I say, doctor," cried I, a few days after my adventure with the goblin, as, in the presence of our host, we were one morning lounging upon the matting in his dwelling, smoking our reed pipes, "Tamai's a thriving place. Why not settle down?" "Faith," said he, "not a bad idea, Paul. But do you fancy they'll let us stay, though?" "Why, certainly. They would be overjoyed to have a couple of karhowries for townsmen." "Gad, you're right, my pleasant fellow. Ha, ha! I'll put up a banana leaf as physician from London, deliver lectures on Polynesian antiquities, teach English in 5 lessons of 1 hour each, establish power looms for the manufacture of tappa, lay out a public park in the middle of the village, and found a festival in honor of Captain Cook." "But surely, not without stopping to take breath," observed I. The doctor's projects, to be sure, were of a rather visionary cast, but we seriously thought, nevertheless, of prolonging our stay in the valley for an indefinite period, and, with this understanding, we were turning over various plans for spending our time pleasantly, when several women came running into the house, and hurriedly besought us to "hurree, hurree," make our escape, crying out something about the missionaries. Thinking that we were about to be taken up under the Act for the Suppression of Vagrancy, we flew out of the house, sprang into a canoe before the door, and paddled with might and main over to the other side of the lake. Approaching Rartoo's dwelling was a great crowd, among which we perceived several natives, who, from their partly European dress, we were certain did not reside in Tamai. Plunging into the groves, we thanked our stars that we had thus narrowly escaped being apprehended as runaway seamen, and marched off to the beach. This, at least, was what we thought we had escaped. Having fled the village, we could not think of prowling about its vicinity and then returning. In doing so, we might be risking our liberty again. We therefore determined upon journeying back to Martair, and setting our faces thitherward, we reached the planter's house about nightfall. They gave us a cordial reception and a hearty supper, and we sat up talking until a late hour. We now prepared to go round to Taloo, a place from which we were not far off when at Tamai; but wishing to see as much of the island as we could, we preferred returning to Martair, and then going round by way of the beach. Taloo, the only frequented harbour of Eimeo, lies on the western side of the island, almost directly over against Martair. Upon one shore of the bay stands the village of Partoowye, a missionary station. In its vicinity is an extensive sugar plantation, the best of the South Seas, perhaps, worked by a person from Sydney. The patrimonial property of the husband of Pomaree, and every way a delightful retreat, Partoowye was one of the occasional residences of the court; but at the time I write of, it was permanently fixed there, the queen having fled thither from Tahiti. Partoowye, they told us, was by no means the place Papeetee was. Ships seldom touched, and very few foreigners were living ashore. A solitary whaler, however, was reported to be lying in the harbour, wooding and watering, and said to be in want of men. All things considered, I could not help looking upon Taloo as offering a splendid opening for us adventurers; to say nothing of the facilities presented for going to sea in the whaler, or hiring ourselves out as day labourers in the sugar plantation. There were hopes to be entertained of being promoted to some office of high trust and emolument, about the person of Her Majesty, the Queen. Nor was this expectation altogether quixotic. In the train of many Polynesian princes, roving whites were frequently found; gentlemen pensioners of state, basking in the tropical sunshine of the court, and leading the pleasantest lives in the world. Upon islands little visited by foreigners, the first seaman that settles down is generally domesticated in the family of the head chief or king, where he frequently discharges the functions of various offices, elsewhere filled by as many different individuals. As historiographer, for instance, he gives the natives some account of distant countries. As commissioner of the arts and sciences, he instructs them in the use of the jackknife, and the best way of shaping bits of iron hoop into spear-heads; and as interpreter to His Majesty, he facilitates intercourse with strangers; besides instructing the people generally in the uses of the most common English phrases, civil and profane, but oftener the latter. These men generally marry well; often, like Hardy of Hannamanoo, into the blood royal. Sometimes they officiate as personal attendant, or first lord-in-waiting, to the king. At Amboy, one of the Tonga Islands, a vagabond Welshman bends his knee as cupbearer to his cannibal majesty. He mixes his morning cup of arva, and, with profound genuflections, presents it in a cocoa-nut bowl, richly carved. Upon another island of the same group, where it is customary to bestow no small pains in dressing the hair, frizzing it out by a curious process into an enormous pope's head, an old man-of-war's man fills the post of barber to the king; and as His Majesty is not very neat, his mop is exceedingly populous; so that, when Jack is not engaged in dressing the head entrusted to his charge, he busies himself in gently titillating it, a sort of skewer being actually worn about the patient's hair for that special purpose. Even upon the Sandwich Islands, a low rabble of foreigners is kept about the person of Tamahamaha, for the purpose of ministering to his ease or enjoyment. Billy Loon, a jolly little negro, tricked out in a soiled blue jacket, studded all over with rusty bell-buttons, and garnished with shabby gold lace, is the royal drummer and pounder of the tambourine. Joe, a wooden-legged Portuguese, who lost his leg by a whale, is violinist; and Mordecai, as he is called, a villainous-looking scamp, going about with his cups and balls in a side pocket, diverts the court with his jugglery. These idle rascals receive no fixed salary, being altogether dependent upon the casual bounty of their master. Now and then they run up a score at the dance-houses in Honolulu, where the illustrious Tamahamaha III afterwards calls and settles the bill. A few years since, an auctioneer to his majesty came near being added to the retinue of state. It seems that he was the first man who had practiced his vocation on the Sandwich Islands; and delighted with the sport of bidding upon his wares, the king was one of his best customers. At last he besought the man to leave his profession, and he should be handsomely provided for at court. But the auctioneer refused, and so the ivory hammer lost the chance of being borne before him on a velvet cushion when the next king went to be crowned. But it was not as strolling players, nor as footmen out of employ, that the doctor and myself looked forward to our approaching introduction to the court of the Queen of Tahiti. On the contrary, as before hinted, we expected to swell the appropriations of breadfruit and cocoanuts on the civil list by filling some honorable office in her gift. We were told that to resist the usurpation of the French, the Queen was rallying about her person all the foreigners she could. Her partiality for the English and Americans was well known, and this was an additional ground for our anticipating a favorable reception. Zeke had informed us, moreover, that by the Queen's counselors at Partoowye, a war of aggression against the invaders at Papeetee had been seriously thought of. Should this prove true, a surgeon's commission for the doctor, and a lieutenancy for myself, were certainly counted upon in our sanguine expectations. Such, then, were our views, and such our hopes in projecting a trip to Taloo. But in our most lofty aspirations, we by no means lost sight of any minor matters which might help us to promotion. The doctor had informed me that he excelled in playing the fiddle. I now suggested that as soon as we arrived at Partoowye, we should endeavor to borrow a violin for him, or if this could not be done, that he should manufacture some kind of a substitute, and thus equipped, apply for an audience of the Queen. Her well-known passion for music would at once secure his admittance, and so, under the most favorable auspices, bring about our introduction to her notice. "And who knows," said my waggish comrade, throwing his head back and performing an imaginary air by briskly drawing one arm across the other, "who knows that I may not fiddle myself into her Majesty's good graces, so as to become a sort of Rizzio to the Tahitian princess?" Chapter 64. How we were to get to Taloo. The inglorious circumstances of our somewhat premature departure from Tamai filled the sagacious doctor and myself with sundry misgivings for the future. Under Zeke's protection, we were secure from all impertinent interference in our concerns on the part of the natives; but as friendless wanderers over the island, we ran the risk of being apprehended as runaways, and as such, sent back to Tahiti. The truth is, that the rewards constantly offered for the apprehension of deserters from ships induced some of the natives to eye all strangers suspiciously. A passport was therefore desirable, but such a thing had never been heard of in Eimeo. At last, Long Ghost suggested that as the Yankee was well known and much respected all over the island, we should endeavor to obtain from him some sort of paper, not only certifying to our having been in his employ, but also to our not being highwaymen, kidnappers, nor yet runaway seamen. Even written in English, a paper like this would answer every purpose; for the unlettered natives, standing in great awe of the document, would not dare to molest us until acquainted with its purport. Then, if it came to the worst, we might repair to the nearest missionary, and have the passport explained. Upon informing Zeke of these matters, he seemed highly flattered with the opinion we entertained of his reputation abroad, and he agreed to oblige us. The doctor at once offered to furnish him with a draft of the paper; but he refused, saying he would write it himself. With a rooster's quill, therefore, a bit of soiled paper, and a stout heart, he set to work. Evidently, he was not accustomed to composition, for his literary throes were so violent that the doctor suggested that some sort of a Caesarean operation might be necessary. The precious paper was at last finished, and a great curiosity it was. We were much diverted with his reasons for not dating it. "In this here dummed climate," he observed, "a feller can't keep the run of the months, nohow, 'cause there's no seasons, no summer and winter to go by. One's eternally thinking it's always July, it's so pesky hot." A passport provided, we cast about for some means of getting to Taloo. The island of Eimeo is very nearly surrounded by a regular breakwater of coral, extending within a mile or less of the shore. The smooth canal within furnishes the best means of communication with the different settlements, all of which, with the exception of Tamai, are right upon the water; and so indolent are the Eimeos that they think nothing of going 20 or 30 miles round the island in a canoe in order to reach a place not a quarter of that distance by land. But as hinted before, the fear of the bullocks has something to do with this. The idea of journeying in a canoe struck our fancy quite pleasantly, and we at once set about chartering one, if possible, but none could we obtain; for not only did we have nothing to pay for hiring one, but we could not expect to have it loaned, inasmuch as the good-natured owner would, in all probability, have to walk along the beach as we paddled, in order to bring back his property when we had no further use for it. At last it was decided to commence our journey on foot, trusting that we would soon fall in with a canoe going our way, in which we might take passage. The planters said we would find no beaten path; all we had to do was to follow the beach; and, however inviting it might look inland, on no account must we stray from it. In short, the longest way round was the nearest way to Taloo. At intervals there were little hamlets along the shore, besides lonely fishermen's huts here and there, where we could get plenty to eat without pay; so there was no necessity to lay in any store. Intending to be off before sunrise the next morning, so as to have the benefit of the coolest part of the day, we bade our kind host farewell overnight; and then, repairing to the beach, we launched our floating pallet, and slept away merrily till dawn. End of chapters 65 and 66. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 67 and 68 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 67. The Journey Round the Beach. It was on the 4th day of the first month of the Hegira, or flight from Tamai, we now reckoned our time thus, that, rising bright and early, we were up and away out of the valley of Martair, before the fishermen even were stirring. It was the earliest dawn. The morning only showed itself along the lower edge of a bank of purple clouds, pierced by the misty peaks of Tahiti. The tropical day seemed too languid to rise. Sometimes, starting fitfully, it decked the clouds with faint edgings of pink and gray, which, fading away, left all dim again. Anon it threw out thin, pale rays, growing lighter and lighter, until, at last, the golden morning sprang out of the east with a bound, darting its bright beams hither and thither, higher and higher, and sending them broadcast over the face of the heavens. All balmy from the groves of Tahiti came an indolent air, cooled by its transit over the waters; and grateful underfoot was the damp and slightly yielding beach, from which the waves seemed just retired. The doctor was in famous spirits. Removing his roora, he went splashing into the sea; and, after swimming a few yards, waded ashore, hopping, skipping, and jumping along the beach, but very careful to cut all his capers in the direction of our journey. Say what they will of the glowing independence one feels in the saddle, give me the first morning flush of your cheery pedestrian. Thus exhilarated, we went on, as light-hearted and care-free as we could wish. And here I cannot refrain from lauding the very superior inducements which most intertropical countries afford, not only to mere rovers like ourselves, but to penniless people generally. In these genial regions, one's wants are naturally diminished, and those which remain are easily gratified. Fuel, house shelter, and, if you please, clothing may be entirely dispensed with. How different are hard northern latitudes! Alas! the lot of a poor devil 20 degrees north of the Tropic of Cancer is indeed pitiable. At last the beach contracted to hardly a yard's width, and the dense thicket almost dipped into the sea. In place of the smooth sand, too, we had sharp fragments of broken coral, which made traveling exceedingly unpleasant. "Lord, my foot!" roared the doctor, fetching it up for inspection, with a galvanic fling of the limb. A sharp splinter had thrust itself into the flesh through a hole in his boot. My sandals were worse yet, their soles taking a sort of fossil impression of everything trod upon. Turning round a bold sweep of the beach, we came upon a piece of fine open ground, with a fisherman's dwelling in the distance, crowning a knoll which rolled off into the water. The hut proved to be a low, rude erection, very recently thrown up, for the bamboos were still green as grass, and the thatching fresh and fragrant as meadow hay. It was open upon 3 sides, so that, upon drawing near, the domestic arrangements within were in plain sight. No one was stirring, and nothing was to be seen but a clumsy old chest of native workmanship, a few calabashes, and bundles of tappa hanging against a post, and a heap of something, we knew not what, in a dark corner. Upon close inspection, the doctor discovered it to be a loving old couple, locked in each other's arms, and rolled together in a tappa mantle. "Halloa, Darby!" he cried, shaking the one with the beard. But Darby heeded him not, though Joan, a wrinkled old body, started up in a fright, and yelled aloud. Neither of us attempted to gag her. She presently became quiet, and after staring hard, and asking some intelligible questions, she proceeded to rouse her still slumbering mate. What ailed him we could not tell, but there was no waking him. Equally in vain were all his dear spouse's cuffs, pinches, and other endearments. He lay like a log, face up, and snoring away like a cavalry trumpeter. "Here, my good woman," said Long Ghost, "just let me try." And, taking the patient right by his nose, he so lifted him bodily into a sitting position, and held him there until his eyes opened. When this event came to pass, Darby looked round like one stupefied, and then, springing to his feet, backed away into a corner, from which place we became the objects of his earnest and respectful attention. "Permit me, my dear Darby, to introduce you to my esteemed friend and comrade, Paul," said the doctor, gallanting me up with all the grimace and flourish imaginable. Upon this, Darby began to recover his faculties, and surprised us not a little by talking a few words of English. So far as could be understood, they were expressive of his having been aware that there were 2 karhowries in the neighborhood, that he was glad to see us, and would have something for us to eat in no time. How he came by his English was explained to us before we left. Some time previous, he had been a denizen of Papeete, where the native language is broidered over with the most classic sailor phrases. He seemed to be quite proud of his residence there, and alluded to it in the same significant way in which a provincial informs you that in his time he has resided in the capital. The old fellow was disposed to be garrulous, but being sharp set, we told him to get breakfast, after which we would hear his anecdotes. While employed among the calabashes, the strange, antiquated fondness between these old semi-savages was really amusing. I made no doubt that they were saying to each other, "Yes, my love," "No, my life," just in the same way that some young couples do at home. They gave us a hearty meal, and, while we were discussing its merits, they assured us over and over again that they expected nothing in return for their attentions. More, we were at liberty to stay as long as we pleased, and, as long as we did stay, their house and everything they had was no longer theirs but ours. Still more, they themselves were our slaves, the old lady to a degree that was altogether superfluous. This now is Tahitian hospitality, self-immolation upon one's own hearthstone for the benefit of the guest. The Polynesians carry their hospitality to an amazing extent. Let a native of Waiurar, the westernmost part of Tahiti, make his appearance as a traveller at Partoowye, the most easternly village of Eimeo. Though a perfect stranger, the inhabitants on all sides accost him at their doorways, inviting him to enter and make himself at home. But the traveller passes on, examining every house attentively, until at last he pauses before one which suits him, and then exclaiming, "Ah, ena maitai! This one will do, I think," he steps in and makes himself perfectly at ease, flinging himself upon the mats, and very probably calling for a nice young cocoanut and a piece of toasted breadfruit, sliced thin, and done brown. Curious to relate, however, should a stranger carrying it thus bravely be afterward discovered to be without a house of his own, why, he may thenceforth go a-begging for his lodgings. The Karhowrees, or white men, are exceptions to this rule. Thus is it precisely as in civilized countries, where those who have houses and lands are incessantly bored to death with invitations to come and live in other people's houses, while many a poor gentleman who inks the seams of his coat, and to whom the like invitation would be really acceptable, may go and sue for it. But to the credit of the ancient Tahitians, it should here be observed that this blemish upon their hospitality is only of recent origin, and was wholly unknown in old times. So told me Captain Bob. In Polynesia it is esteemed a "great hit" if a man succeeded in marrying into a family to which the best part of the community is related. Heaven knows it is otherwise with us. The reason is, that when he goes a-travelling, the greater number of houses are the more completely at his service. Receiving a paternal benediction from old Darby and Joan, we continued our journey, resolved to stop at the very next place of attraction which offered. Nor did we long stroll for it. A fine walk along a beach of shells, and we came to a spot where with trees here and there the land was all meadow, sloping away to the water, which stirred a sedgy growth of reeds bordering its margin. Close by was a little cove, walled in with coral, where a fleet of canoes was dancing up and down. A few paces distant, on a natural terrace overlooking the sea, were several native dwellings, newly thatched, and peeping into view out of the foliage, like summer houses. As we drew near, forth came a burst of voices, and presently 3 gay girls, overflowing with life, health, and youth, and full of spirits and mischief. One was arrayed in a flaunting robe of calico, and her long black hair was braided behind in 2 immense tresses, joined together at the ends, and wreathed with the green tendrils of a vine. From her self-possessed and forward air, I fancied she might be some young lady from Papeetee on a visit to her country relations. Her companions wore mere slips of cotton cloth; their hair was dishevelled, and, though very pretty, they betrayed the reserve and embarrassment characteristic of the provinces. The little gypsy first mentioned ran up to me with great cordiality, and giving the Tahitian salutation, opened upon me such a fire of questions that there was no understanding, much less answering them. But our hearty welcome to Loohooloo, as she called the hamlet, was made plain enough. Meanwhile, Dr. Longghost gallantly presented an arm to each of the other young ladies, which at first they knew not what to make of; but at last, taking it for some kind of joke, accepted the civility. The names of these 3 damsels were at once made known by themselves, and being so exceedingly romantic, I cannot forbear particularizing them. Upon my comrades' arms, then, were hanging Night and Morning in the persons of Farnowar, or the Day-born, and Farnoopoo, or the Night-born. She with the tresses was very appropriately styled Marhar-Rar-Rar, the Wakeful, or Bright-eyed. By this time, the houses were emptied of the rest of their inmates, a few old men and women, and several strapping young fellows rubbing their eyes and yawning. All crowded round, putting questions as to whence we came. Upon being informed of our acquaintance with Zeke, they were delighted; and one of them recognized the boots worn by the doctor. Kiki, Zeke, Mai Tai, they cried. Nui Nui Hana Hana Portarto, makes plenty of potatoes. There was now a little friendly altercation as to who should have the honor of entertaining the strangers. At last a tall old gentleman, by name Marharvai, with a bald head and white beard, took us each by the hand and led us into his dwelling. Once inside, Marharvai, pointing about with his staff, was so obsequious in assuring us that his house was ours, that Longo suggested he might as well hand over the deed. It was drawing near noon, so after a light lunch of roasted breadfruit, a few whiffs of a pipe, and some lively chatting, our host admonished the company to lie down and take the everlasting siesta. We complied, and had a social nap all round. Chapter 68. A Dinner Party in Eimeo. It was just in the middle of the merry, mellow afternoon that they ushered us to dinner, underneath a green shelter of palm boughs, open all round and so low at the eaves that we stooped to enter. Within, the ground was strewn over with aromatic ferns, called nahi, freshly gathered, which, stirred underfoot, diffused the sweetest odor. On one side was a row of yellow mats inwrought with fibers of bark, stained a bright red. Here, seated after the fashion of the Turk, we looked out, over a verdant bank, upon the mild, blue, endless Pacific. So far round had we skirted the island, that the view of Tahiti was now intercepted. Upon the ferns before us were laid several layers of broad thick puru leaves, lapping over, one upon the other; and upon these were placed, side by side, newly plucked banana leaves, at least 2 yards in length and very wide. The stalks were withdrawn so as to make them lie flat. This green cloth was set out and garnished in the manner following. First, a number of puru leaves, by way of plates, were ranged along on one side, and by each was a rustic nut bowl, half filled with sea water, and a Tahitian roll, or small breadfruit, roasted brown. An immense flat calabash, placed in the center, was heaped up with numberless small packages of moist, steaming leaves. In each was a small fish, baked in the earth, and done to a turn. This pyramid of a dish was flanked on either side by an ornamental calabash. One was brimming with the golden-hued poee, or pudding, made from the red plantain of the mountains. The other was stacked up with cakes of the Indian turnip, previously macerated on a mortar, kneaded with the milk of the cocoanut, and then baked. In the spaces between the 3 dishes were piled young cocoanuts, stripped of their husks. Their eyes had been opened and enlarged, so that each was a ready charged goblet. There was a sort of side-cloth in one corner, upon which, in bright buff jackets, lay the fattest of bananas, avies, red ripe, guavas, with the shadows of their crimson pulp flushing through a transparent skin, and almost coming and going there like blushes; oranges, tinged here and there berry brown; and great jolly melons, which rolled about in very portliness. Such a heap! All ruddy, ripe, and round, bursting with the good cheer of the tropical soil from which they sprang. "A land of orchards!" cried the doctor in a rapture, and he snatched a morsel from a sort of fruit of which gentlemen of the sanguine temperament are remarkably fond, namely, the ripe cherry lips of Miss Dayborn, who stood looking on. Marharvai allotted seats to his guests, and the meal began. Thinking that his hospitality needed some acknowledgment, I rose and pledged him in the vegetable wine of the cocoanut, merely repeating the ordinary salutation, Yar Onor Boyowi. Sensible that some compliment, after the fashion of white men, was paid him, with a smile and a courteous flourish of the hand, he bade me be seated. No people, however refined, are more easy and graceful in their manners than the Eimeos. The doctor, sitting next our host, now came under his special protection. Laying before his guest one of the packages of fish, Marharvai opened it and commended its contents to his particular regards. But my comrade was one of those who, on convivial occasions, can always take care of themselves. He ate an indefinite number of pehi lilis, small fish, his own and his next neighbor's breadfruit, and helped himself, to right and left, with all the ease of an accomplished diner out. "Paul," said he at last, "you don't seem to be getting along. Why don't you try the pepper sauce?" And by way of example he steeped a morsel of food into his nutful of sea water. On following suit, I found it quite piquant, though rather bitter, but on the whole a capital substitute for salt. The Aimeos invariably use sea water in this way, deeming it quite a treat, and considering that their country is surrounded by an ocean of ketchup, the luxury cannot be deemed an expensive one. The fish were delicious, the manner of cooking them in the ground, preserving all the juices, and rendering them exceedingly sweet and tender. The plantain pudding was almost cloying, the cakes of Indian turnip quite palatable, and the roasted breadfruit crisp as toast. During the meal a native lad walked round and round the party, carrying a long staff of bamboo. This he occasionally tapped upon the cloth before each guest, when a white clotted substance dropped forth, with a savour not unlike that of a curd. This proved to be loni, an excellent relish, prepared from the grated meat of ripe cocoanuts, moistened with cocoanut milk and sea water, and kept perfectly tight, until a little past the saccharine stage of fermentation. Throughout the repast there was much lively chatting among the islanders, in which their conversational powers quite exceeded ours. The young ladies, too, showed themselves very expert in the use of their tongues, and contributed much to the gaiety which prevailed. Nor did these lively nymphs suffer the meal to languish, for upon the doctor's throwing himself back, with an air of much satisfaction, they sprang to their feet, and pelted him with oranges and guavas. This at last put an end to the entertainment. By 100 whimsical oddities, my long friend became a great favorite with these people, and they bestowed upon him a long, comical title, expressive of his lank figure and rura combined. The latter, by the by, never failed to excite the remark of everybody we encountered. The giving of nicknames is quite a passion with the people of Tahiti and Aimeo. No one, with any peculiarity, whether of person or temper, is exempt, not even strangers. A pompous captain of a man-of-war, visiting Tahiti for the second time, discovered that, among the natives, he went by the dignified title of Atipoe, literally, Poe head, or pudding head. Nor is the highest rank among themselves any protection. The first husband of the present queen was commonly known in the court circles as Pot-belly. He carried the greater part of his person before him, to be sure, and so did the gentlemanly George IV., but what a title for a king consort! Even Pomaree itself, the royal patronymic, was originally a mere nickname, and literally signifies one talking through one's nose. The first monarch of that name, being on a war party, and sleeping overnight among the mountains, awoke one morning with a cold in his head, and some wag of a courtier had no more manners than to vulgarize him thus. How different from the volatile Polynesian in this, as in all other respects, is our grave and decorous North American Indian. While the former bestows a name in accordance with some humorous or ignoble trait, the latter seizes upon what is deemed the most exalted or warlike, and hence among the red tribes we have the truly patrician appellations of White Eagles, Young Oaks, Fiery Eyes, and Bended Bows. End of chapters 67 and 68. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 69 and 70 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 69. The Cocoa Palm. While the doctor and the natives were taking a digestive nap after dinner, I strolled forth to have a peep at the country which could produce so generous a meal. To my surprise, a fine strip of land in the vicinity of the hamlet, and protected seaward by a grove of cocoanut and breadfruit trees, was under high cultivation. Sweet potatoes, Indian turnips, and yams were growing, also melons, a few pineapples, and other fruits. Still more pleasing was the sight of young breadfruit and cocoanut trees set out with great care, as if for once the improvident Polynesian had thought of his posterity. But this was the only instance of native thrift which ever came under my observation. For, in all my rambles over Tahiti and Eimeo, nothing so much struck me as the comparative scarcity of these trees in many places where they ought to abound. Entire valleys, like Martair, of inexhaustible fertility, are abandoned to all the rankness of untamed vegetation. Alluvial flats bordering the sea, and watered by streams from the mountains, are overgrown with a wild, scrub guava bush, introduced by foreigners, and which spreads with such fatal rapidity that the natives, standing still while it grows, anticipate its covering the entire island. Even tracts of clear land, which, with so little pains, might be made to wave with orchards, lie wholly neglected. When I consider their unequalled soil and climate, thus unaccountably slighted, I often turned in amazement upon the natives about Papeetee, some of whom all but starve in their gardens run to waste. Upon other islands which I have visited, of similar fertility, and wholly unreclaimed from their first discovered condition, no spectacle of this sort was presented. The high estimation in which many of their breadfruit trees are held by the Tahitians and Aimeos, their beauty in the landscape, their manifold uses, and the facility with which they are propagated, are considerations which render the remissness alluded to still more unaccountable. The cocoa palm is an example, a tree by far the most important production of nature in the tropics. To the Polynesian, it is emphatically the tree of life, transcending even the breadfruit in the multifarious uses to which it is applied. Its very aspect is imposing. Asserting its supremacy by an erect and lofty bearing, it may be said to compare with our trees, as man with inferior creatures. The blessings it confers are incalculable. Year after year, the islanders repose beneath its shade, both eating and drinking of its fruit. He thatches his hut with its boughs, and weaves them into baskets to carry his food. He cools himself with a fan plaited from the young leaflets, and shades his head from the sun by a bonnet of the leaves. Sometimes he clothes himself with the cloth-like substance which wraps round the base of the stalks, whose elastic rods, strung with filberts, are used as a taper. The larger nuts, thinned and polished, furnish him with a beautiful goblet; the smaller ones, with bowls for his pipes; the dry husks kindle his fires; their fibers are twisted into fishing lines and cords for his canoes. He heals his wounds with a balsam compounded from the juice of the nut; and, with the oil extracted from its meat, embalms the bodies of the dead. The noble trunk itself is far from being valueless. Sawn into posts, it upholds the islander's dwelling; converted into charcoal, it cooks his food; and supported on blocks of stones, rails in his lands. He impels his canoe through the water with a paddle of the wood, and goes to battle with clubs and spears of the same hard material. In pagan Tahiti, a cocoa-nut branch was the symbol of regal authority. Laid upon the sacrifice in the temple, it made the offering sacred; and with it the priests chastised and put to flight the evil spirits which assailed them. The supreme majesty of Oro, the great god of their mythology, was declared in the cocoa-nut log from which his image was rudely carved. Upon one of the Tonga Islands there stands a living tree, revered itself as a deity. Even upon the Sandwich Islands, the cocoa palm retains all its ancient reputation, the people there having thought of adopting it as the national emblem. The cocoa-nut is planted as follows. Selecting a suitable place, you drop into the ground a fully ripe nut, and leave it. In a few days, a thin, lance-like shoot forces itself through a minute hole in the shell, pierces the husk, and soon unfolds 3 pale green leaves in the air; while originating, in the same soft white sponge which now completely fills the nut, a pair of fibrous roots, pushing away the stoppers which close 2 holes in an opposite direction, penetrate the shell, and strike vertically into the ground. A day or 2 more, and the shell and husk, which in the last and germinating stage of the nut are so hard that a knife will scarcely make any impression, spontaneously burst by some force within. and henceforth the hardy young plant thrives apace, and needing no culture, pruning, or attention of any sort, rapidly arrives at maturity. In 4 or 5 years it bears. In twice as many more it begins to lift its head among the groves, where, waxing strong, it flourishes for near a century. Thus, as some voyager has said, the man who but drops one of those nuts into the ground may be said to confer a greater and more certain benefit upon himself and posterity than many a life's toil in less genial climes. The fruitfulness of the tree is remarkable. As long as it lives, it bears, and without intermission. 200 nuts, besides innumerable white blossoms of others, may be seen upon it at one time; and though a whole year is required to bring any one of them to the germinating point, no two, perhaps, are at one time in precisely the same stage of growth. The tree delights in a maritime situation. In its greatest perfection, it is perhaps found right on the seashore, where its roots are actually washed. But such instances are only met with upon islands where the swell of the sea is prevented from breaking on the beach by an encircling reef. No saline flavor is perceptible in the nut produced in such a place. Although it bears in any soil, whether upland or bottom, it does not flourish vigorously inland; and I have frequently observed, that when met with far up in the valleys, its tall stem inclines seaward, as if pining after a more genial region. It is a curious fact that, if you deprive the cocoa-nut tree of the verdant tuft at its head, it dies at once; and if allowed to stand thus, the trunk, which, when alive, is encased in so hard a bark as to be almost impervious to a bullet, moulders away, and, in an incredibly short period, becomes dust. This is, perhaps, partly owing to the peculiar constitution of the trunk, a mere cylinder of minute hollow reeds, closely packed, and very hard; but when exposed at top, peculiarly fitted to convey moisture and decay through the entire stem. The finest orchard of cocoa palms I know, and the only plantation of them I ever saw at the islands, is one that stands right upon the southern shore of Papeetee Bay. They were set out by the first Pomaree almost a half century ago, and the soil being especially adapted to their growth, the noble trees now form a magnificent grove, nearly a mile in extent. No other plant, scarcely a bush, is to be seen within its precincts. The broom road passes through its entire length. At noonday, this grove is one of the most beautiful, serene, witching places that ever was seen. High overhead are ranges of green rustling arches, through which the sun's rays come down to you in sparkles. You seem to be wandering through illimitable halls of pillars. Everywhere you catch glimpses of stately aisles, intersecting each other at all points. A strange silence, too, reigns far and near, the air flushed with the mellow stillness of a sunset. But after the long morning calms, the sea breeze comes in, and creeping over the tops of these 1,000 trees, they nod their plumes. Soon the breeze freshens, and you hear the branches brushing against each other, and the flexible trunks begin to sway. Towards evening, the whole grove is rocking to and fro, and the traveler on the broom road is startled by the frequent falling of the nuts, snapped from their brittle stems. They come flying through the air, ringing like jugglers' balls, and often bound along the ground for many rods. Chapter 70. Life at Luhulu. Finding the society at Luhulu very pleasant, the young ladies in particular being extremely sociable, and, moreover, in love with the famous good cheer of old Marharvai, we acquiesced in an invitation of his to tarry a few days longer. We might then, he said, join a small canoe party, which was going to a place a league or two distant. So averse to all exertion are these people, that they really thought the prospect of thus getting rid of a few miles walking would prevail with us, even if there were no other inducement. The people of the hamlet, as we soon discovered, formed a snug little community of cousins, of which our host seemed the head. Marharvai, in truth, was a petty chief, who owned the neighboring islands; and as the wealthy, in most cases, rejoice in a numerous kindred, the family footing upon which everybody visited him was, perhaps, ascribable to the fact of his being the lord of the manor. Like Captain Bob, he was in some things a gentleman of the old school, a stickler for the customs of a past and pagan age. Nowhere else except in Tamai did we find the manners of the natives less vitiated by recent changes. The old-fashioned Tahitian dinner they gave us on the day of our arrival was a fair sample of their general mode of living. Our time passed delightfully. The doctor went his way, and I mine. With a pleasant companion, he was forever strolling inland, ostensibly to collect botanical specimens, while I, for the most part, kept near the sea, sometimes taking the girls an aquatic excursion in a canoe. Often we went fishing, not dozing over stupid hooks and lines, but leaping right into the water and chasing our prey over the coral rocks, spear in hand. Spearing fish is a glorious sport. The Emeeos, all round the island, catch them in no other way. The smooth shallows between the reef and the shore, and at low water the reef itself, being admirably adapted to this mode of capturing them. At almost any time of the day, save ever the sacred hour of noon, you may see the fish hunters pursuing their sport, with loud halloos brandishing their spears and splashing through the water in all directions. Sometimes a solitary native is seen, far out upon a lonely shallow, wading slowly along, with eye intent and poised spear. But the best sport of all is going out upon the great reef itself by torchlight. The natives follow this recreation with as much spirit as a gentleman of England does the chase, and take full as much delight in it. The torch is nothing more than a bunch of dry reeds bound firmly together; the spear, a long light pole with an iron head, on one side barbed. I shall never forget the night that old Marharvai and the rest of us, paddling off to the reef, leaped at midnight upon the coral ledges with waving torches and spears. We were more than a mile from the land. The sullen ocean, thundering upon the outside of the rocks, dashed the spray in our faces, almost extinguishing the flambeaux; and, far as the eye could reach, the darkness of sky and water was streaked with a long, misty line of foam marking the course of the coral barrier. The wild fishermen, flourishing their weapons, and yelling like so many demons to scare their prey, sprang from ledge to ledge, and sometimes darted their spears in the very midst of the breakers. But fish-spearing was not the only sport we had at Luhulu. Right on the beach was a mighty old cocoa-nut tree, the roots of which had been underwashed by the waves, so that the trunk inclined far over its base. From the tuft of the tree a stout cord of bark depended, the end of which swept the water several yards from the shore. This was a Tahitian swing. A native lad seizes hold of the cord, and, after swinging to and fro quite leisurely, all at once sends himself 50 or 60 feet from the water, rushing through the air like a rocket. I doubt whether any of our rope dancers would attempt the feat. For my own part, I had neither head nor heart for it; so, after sending a lad aloft with an additional cord, by way of security, I constructed a large basket of green boughs, in which I and some particular friends of mine used to swing over sea and land by the hour. End of chapters 69 and 70. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 71 and 72 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 71. We start for Taloo. Bright was the morning, and brighter still the smiles of the young ladies who accompanied us, when we sprang into a sort of family canoe, wide and roomy, and bid adieu to the hospitable Marharvai and his tenantry. As we paddled away, they stood on the beach, waving their hands and crying out, "Aroha! Aroha!" (farewell, farewell), as long as we were within hearing. Very sad at parting with them, we endeavored, nevertheless, to console ourselves in the society of our fellow passengers. Among these were 2 old ladies, but as they said nothing to us, we will say nothing about them, nor anything about the old men who managed the canoe. But of the 3 mischievous, dark-eyed young witches, who lounged in the stern of that comfortable old island gondola, I have a great deal to say. In the first place, one of them was Marhar, the bright-eyed; and in the second place, neither she nor the Romps, her companions, ever dreamed of taking the voyage until the doctor and myself announced our intention. Their going along was nothing more than a madcap frolic. In short, they were a parcel of wicked hoydens, bent on mischief, who laughed in your face when you looked sentimental, and only tolerated your company when making merry at your expense. Something or other about us was perpetually awaking their mirth. Attributing this to his own remarkable figure, the doctor increased their enjoyment by assuming the part of a merry andrew. Yet his cap and bells never jingled but to some tune, and while playing the tom-fool, I more than suspected that he was trying to play the rake. At home, it is deemed auspicious to go a-wooing in epaulets; but coming among the Polynesians, your best dress in courting is motley. A fresh breeze springing up, we set our sail of matting, and glided along as tranquilly as if floating upon an inland stream, the white reef on one hand and the green shore on the other. Soon as we turned a headland, we encountered another canoe, paddling with might and main in an opposite direction, the strangers shouting to each other, and a tall fellow in the bow dancing up and down like a crazy man. They shot by us like an arrow, though our fellow voyagers shouted again and again for them to cease paddling. According to the natives, this was a kind of royal mail canoe, carrying a message from the queen to her friends in a distant part of the island. Passing several shady bowers, which looked quite inviting, we proposed touching, and diversifying the monotony of a sea voyage by a stroll ashore. So, forcing our canoe among the bushes, behind a decayed palm lying partly in the water, we left the old folks to take a nap in the shade, and gallanted the others among the trees, which were here trellised with vines and creeping shrubs. In the early part of the afternoon, we drew near the place to which the party were going. It was a solitary house, inhabited by 4 or 5 old women, who, when we entered, were gathered in a circle about the mats, eating poee from a cracked calabash. They seemed delighted at seeing our companions, but rather drew up when introduced to ourselves. Eyeing us distrustfully, they whispered to know who we were. The answers they received were not satisfactory, for they treated us with marked coolness and reserve, and seemed desirous of breaking off our acquaintance with the girls. Unwilling, therefore, to stay where our company was disagreeable, we resolved to depart without even eating a meal. Informed of this, Marhar and her companions evinced the most lively concern, and equally unmindful of their former spirits, and the remonstrances of the old ladies, broke forth into sobs and lamentations which were not to be withstood. We agreed, therefore, to tarry until they left for home, which would be at the Aheharar, or falling of the sun, in other words, at sunset. When the hour arrived, after much leave-taking, we saw them safely embarked. As the canoe turned a bluff, they seized the paddles from the hands of the old men and waved them silently in the air. This was meant for a touching farewell, as the paddle is only waved thus when the parties separating never more expect to meet. We now continued our journey, and, following the beach, soon came to a level and lofty overhanging bank, which, planted here and there with trees, took a broad sweep round a considerable part of the island. A fine pathway skirted the edge of the bank, and often we paused to admire the scenery. The evening was still and fair, even for so heavenly a climate; and all round, far as the eye could reach, was the bending blue sky and ocean. As we went on, the reef belt still accompanied us, turning as we turned, and thundering its distant bass upon the ear, like the unbroken roar of a cataract. Dashing forever against their coral rampart, the breakers looked, in the distance, like a line of rearing white chargers, reined in, tossing their white manes, and bridling with foam. These great natural breakwaters are admirably designed for the protection of this land. Nearly all the Society Islands are defended by them. Were the vast swells of the Pacific to break against the soft alluvial bottoms, which in many places border the sea, the soil would soon be washed away, and the natives be thus deprived of their most productive lands. As it is, the banks of no rivulet are firmer. But the coral barriers answer another purpose. They form all the harbors of this group, including the 24 round about the shores of Tahiti. Curiously enough, the openings in the reefs, by which alone vessels enter to their anchorage, are invariably opposite the mouths of running streams, an advantage fully appreciated by the mariner who touches for the purpose of watering his ship. It is said that the fresh water of the island, mixing with the salts held in solution by the sea, so acts upon the latter as to resist the formation of the coral, and hence the breaks. Here and there these openings are sentineled, as it were, by little fairy islets, green as emerald and waving with palms. Strangely and beautifully diversifying the line of breakers, no objects can strike the fancy more vividly. Pomaree II, with a taste in watering places truly Tahitian, selected one of them as a royal retreat. We passed it on our journey. Omitting several further adventures which befell us after leaving the party from Luhulu, we must now hurry on, to relate what happened just before reaching the place of our destination. Chapter 72. A Dealer in the Contraband. It must have been at least the 10th day, reckoning from the Hegira, that we found ourselves the guests of Varvy, an old hermit of an islander, who kept house by himself, perhaps a couple of leagues from Taloo. A stone's cast from the beach, there was a fantastic rock, moss-grown, and deep in a dell. It was insulated by a shallow brook, which, dividing its waters, flowed on both sides, until united below. Twisting its roots round the rock, a gnarled aowa spread itself overhead in a wilderness of foliage; the elastic branch roots, depending from the larger boughs, insinuating themselves into every cleft, thus forming supports to the parent stem. In some places, these pendulous branches, half grown, had not yet reached the rock, swinging their loose fibrous ends in the air like whiplashes. Varvy's hut, a mere coop of bamboos, was perched upon a level part of the rock, the ridge-pole resting at one end in a crotch of the aowa, and the other propped by a forked bough planted in a fissure. Notwithstanding our cries as we drew near, the first hint the old hermit received of our approach was the doctor's stepping up and touching his shoulder, as he was kneeling over on a stone, cleaning fish in the brook. He leaped up and stared at us; but with a variety of uncouth gestures, he soon made us welcome, informing us, by the same means, that he was both deaf and dumb. He then motioned us into his dwelling. Going in, we threw ourselves upon an old mat, and peered round. The soiled bamboos and calabashes looked so uninviting, that the doctor was for pushing on to Taloo that night, notwithstanding it was near sunset. But at length we concluded to stay where we were. After a good deal of bustling outside, under a decrepit shed, the old man made his appearance with our supper. In one hand he held a flickering taper, and in the other a huge, flat calabash scantily filled with viands. His eyes were dancing in his head, and he looked from the calabash to us, and from us to the calabash, as much to say, "Ah, my lads, what do ye think of this, eh? Pretty good cheer, eh?" But the fish and Indian turnip being none of the best, we made but a sorry meal. While discussing it, the old man tried hard to make himself understood by signs, most of which were so excessively ludicrous, that we made no doubt he was perpetrating a series of pantomimic jokes. The remnants of the feast removed, our host left us for a moment, returning with a calabash of portly dimensions, and furnished with a long hooded neck, the mouth of which was stopped with a wooden plug. It was covered with particles of earth, and looked as if just taken from some place underground. With sundry winks and horrible giggles peculiar to the dumb, the vegetable demijohn was now tapped; the old fellow looking round cautiously and pointing at it, as much as to intimate that it contained something which was taboo or forbidden. Aware that intoxicating liquors were strictly prohibited to the natives, we now watched our entertainer with much interest. Charging a cocoa-nut shell, he tossed it off, and then filling it up again, presented the goblet to me. Disliking the smell, I made faces at it, upon which he became highly excited, so much so that a miracle was wrought upon the spot. Snatching the cup from my hands, he shouted out, "Ah, karhowree sabi lili, ena arva te maitai!" In other words, "What a blockhead of a white man! This is the real stuff." We could not have been more startled had a frog leaped from his mouth. For an instant he looked confused enough himself, and then, placing a finger mysteriously upon his mouth, he contrived to make us understand that at times he was subject to a suspension of the powers of speech. Deeming the phenomenon a remarkable one, every way, the doctor desired him to open his mouth, so that he might have a look down, but he refused. This occurrence made us rather suspicious of our host, nor could we afterwards account for his conduct, except by supposing that his feigning deafness might in some way or other assist him in the nefarious pursuits in which it afterwards turned out that he was engaged. This conclusion, however, was not altogether satisfactory. To oblige him, we at last took a sip of his arva tea, and found it very crude and strong as lucifer. Curious to know whence it was obtained, we questioned him, when, lighting up with pleasure, he seized the taper and led us outside the hut, bidding us follow. After going some distance through the woods, we came to a dismantled old shed of boughs, apparently abandoned to decay. Underneath, nothing was to be seen but heaps of decaying leaves, and an immense clumsy jar, wide-mouthed, and, by some means, rudely hollowed out from a ponderous stone. Here, for a while, we were left to ourselves, the old man placing the light in the jar and then disappearing. He returned, carrying a long, large bamboo and a crotched stick. Throwing these down, he poked under a pile of rubbish and brought out a rough block of wood, pierced through and through with a hole, which was immediately clapped on top of the jar. Then planting the crotched stick upright about 2 yards distant, and making it sustain one end of the bamboo, he inserted the other end of the latter into the hole in the block, concluding these arrangements by placing an old calabash under the further end of the bamboo. Coming up to us now with a sly, significant look, and pointing admirably at his apparatus, he exclaimed, "Ah, kahowree, ena hana hana arvatee," as much as to say, "This, you see, is the way it's done." His contrivance was nothing less than a native still, where he manufactured his island poteen. The disarray in which we found it was probably intentional, as a security against detection. Before we left the shed, the old fellow toppled the whole concern over, and dragged it away piecemeal. His disclosing his secret to us thus was characteristic of the Tootai Owrees, or condemners of the missionaries among the natives, who, presuming that all foreigners are opposed to the ascendancy of the missionaries, take pleasure in making them confidants, whenever the enactments of their rulers are secretly set at naught. The substance from which the liquor is produced is called tea, which is a large, fibrous root, something like a yam, but smaller. In its green state it is exceedingly acrid, but boiled or baked has the sweetness of the sugar cane. After being subjected to the fire, macerated, and reduced to a certain stage of fermentation, the tea is stirred up with water, and is then ready for distillation. On returning to the hut, pipes were introduced, and after a while Long Ghost, who at first had relished the arva tea as little as myself, to my surprise began to wax sociable over it with Varvy, and before long absolutely got mellow, the old toper keeping him company. It was a curious sight. Every one knows that, so long as the occasion lasts, there is no stronger bond of sympathy and good feeling among men than getting tipsy together; and how earnestly, nay movingly, a brace of worthies thus employed will endeavour to shed light upon and elucidate their mystical ideas. Fancy Varvy and the doctor then, lovingly tippling, and brimming over with a desire to become better acquainted, the doctor politely bent upon carrying on the conversation in the language of his host, and the old hermit persisting in trying to talk English. The result was, that between the two, they made such a fricassee of vowels and consonants, that it was enough to turn one's brain. The next morning, on waking, I heard a voice from the tombs. It was the doctor, solemnly pronouncing himself a dead man. He was sitting up, with both hands clasped over his forehead, and his pale face 1,000 times paler than ever. "That infernal stuff has murdered me!" he cried. "Heavens! My head's all wheels and springs, like the automaton chess player. What's to be done, Paul? I'm poisoned." But after drinking an herbal draught concocted by our host, and eating a light meal at noon, he felt much better; so much so that he declared himself ready to continue our journey. When we came to start, the Yankees' boots were missing, and after a diligent search were not to be found. Enraged beyond measure, their proprietor said that Varvy must have stolen them; but considering his hospitality, I thought this extremely improbable, though to whom else to impute the theft I knew not. The doctor maintained, however, that one who was capable of drugging an innocent traveler with arva tea was capable of anything. But it was in vain that he stormed, and Varvy and I searched. The boots were gone. Were it not for this mysterious occurrence and Varvy's detestable liquors, I would here recommend all travelers going round by the beach to Partoowye to stop at the Rock and patronize the old gentleman, the more especially as he entertains gratis. End of chapters 71 and 72. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 73 and 74 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 73. Our reception at Partoowye. Upon starting at last, I flung away my sandals, by this time quite worn out, with the view of keeping company with the doctor, now forced to go barefooted. Recovering his spirits in good time, he protested that boots were a bore after all, and going without them decidedly manly. This was said, be it observed, while strolling along over a soft carpet of grass, a little moist, even at midday, from the shade of the wood through which we were passing. Emerging from this, we entered upon a blank, sandy tract, upon which the sun's rays fairly flashed, making the loose gravel underfoot well nigh as hot as the floor of an oven. Such yelling and leaping as there was in getting over this ground would be hard to surpass. We could not have crossed at all, until towards sunset, had it not been for a few small, wiry bushes growing here and there, into which we every now and then thrust our feet to cool. There was no little judgment necessary in selecting your bush, for if not chosen judiciously, the chances were that on springing forward again and finding the next bush so far off that an intermediate cooling was indispensable, you would have to run back to your old place again. Safely passing the Sahara, or fiery desert, we soothed our half-blistered feet by a pleasant walk through a meadow of long grass, which soon brought us in sight of a few straggling houses sheltered by a grove on the outskirts of the village of Partoowye. My comrade was for entering the first one we came to, but on drawing near, they had so much of an air of pretension, at least for native dwellings, that I hesitated, thinking they might be the residences of the higher chiefs, from whom no very extravagant welcome was to be anticipated. While standing irresolute, a voice from the nearest house hailed us. "Aramai, Aramai, Karhowree! Come in, strangers!" We at once entered, and were warmly greeted. The master of the house was an aristocratic-looking islander, dressed in loose cotton drawers, a fine white shirt, and a sash of red silk tied around the waist, after the fashion of the Spaniards in Chile. He came up to us with a free, frank air, and striking his chest with his hand, introduced himself as Irimir Popo, or to render the Christian name back again into English, Jeremiah Popo. These curious combinations of names among the people of the Society Islands originate in the following way. When a native is baptized, his patronymic often gives offense to the missionaries, and they insist upon changing to something else whatever is objectionable therein. So when Jeremiah came to the font, and gave his name as Narmo Nana Popo, something equivalent to the Darer of the Devils by Night, the reverend gentleman officiating told him that such a heathenish appellation would never do, and a substitute must be had, at least for the devil part of it. Some highly respectable Christian appellations were then submitted, from which the candidate for admission into the church was at liberty to choose. There was Adamo, Adam; Noar, Noah; Davidar, David; Irkobar, James; Eorna, John; Patura, Peter; Erimar, Jeremiah, etc. And thus did he come to be named Jeremiah Popo, or Jeremiah in the dark, which he certainly was, I fancy, as to the ridiculousness of his new cognomen. We gave our names in return, upon which he bade us be seated, and sitting down himself, asked us a great many questions in mixed English and Tahitian. After giving some directions to an old man to prepare food, our host's wife, a large, benevolent-looking woman, upwards of 40, also sat down by us. In our soiled and travel-stained appearance, the good lady seemed to find abundant matter for commiseration, and all the while kept looking at us piteously, and making mournful exclamations. But Jeremiah and his spouse were not the only inmates of the mansion. In one corner, upon a large native couch, elevated upon posts, reclined a nymph, who, half veiled in her own long hair, had yet to make her toilet for the day. She was the only daughter of Popo, and a very beautiful little daughter she was, not more than 14, with the most delightful shape, like a bud just blown, and large hazel eyes. They called her Loo, a name rather pretty and genteel, and therefore quite appropriate, for a more genteel and ladylike little damsel there was not in all Eimeo. She was a cold and haughty young beauty though, this same little Loo, and never deigned to notice us, further than now and then to let her eyes float over our persons with an expression of indolent indifference. With the tears of the Luhulu girls hardly dry from their sobbing upon our shoulders, this contemptuous treatment stung us not a little. When we first entered, Popo was raking smooth the carpet of dried ferns which had that morning been newly laid, and now that our meal was ready, it was spread on a banana leaf right upon this fragrant floor. Here we lounged at our ease, eating baked pig and breadfruit off earthen plates, and using, for the first time in many a long month, real knives and forks. These, as well as other symptoms of refinement, somewhat abated our surprise at the reserve of the little Loo. Her parents, doubtless, were magnates in Partoowye, and she herself was an heiress. After being informed of our stay in the Vale of Martair, they were very curious to know on what errand we came to Taloo. We merely hinted that the ship lying in the harbour was the reason of our coming. Our Friti, Popo's wife, was a right motherly body. The meal over, she recommended a nap, and upon our waking much refreshed, she led us to the doorway and pointed down among the trees, through which we saw the gleam of water. Taking the hint, we repaired thither, and finding a deep-shaded pool, bathed and returned to the house. Our hostess now sat down by us, and after looking with great interest at the doctor's cloak, felt of my own soiled and tattered garments for the 100th time, and exclaimed plaintively, "Ah, nui nui oli mani, oli mani!" Alas, they are very, very old, very old. When our Friti, good soul, thus addressed us, she thought she was talking very respectable English. The word nui is so familiar to foreigners throughout Polynesia, and is so often used by them in their intercourse with the natives, that the latter suppose it to be common to all mankind. Oli mani is the native pronunciation of old man, which by Society Islanders talking Saxon is applied indiscriminately to all aged things and persons whatsoever. Going to a chest filled with various European articles, she took out 2 suits of new sailor frocks and trousers, and presenting them with a gracious smile, pushed us behind a calico screen and left us. Without any fastidious scruples, we donned the garments, and what with the meal, the nap, and the bath, we now came forth like a couple of bridegrooms. Evening drawing on, lamps were lighted. They were very simple, the half of a green melon, about 1/3 full of cocoanut oil, and a wick of twisted tappa floating on the surface. As a night lamp, this contrivance cannot be excelled, a soft dreamy light being shed through the transparent rind. As the evening advanced, other members of the household, whom as yet we had not seen, began to drop in. There was a slender young dandy in a gay striped shirt, and whole fathoms of bright-figured calico tucked about his waist, and falling to the ground. He wore a new straw hat, also, with 3 distinct ribbons tied about the crown, one black, one green, and one pink. Shoes or stockings, however, he had none. There were a couple of delicate, olive-cheeked little girls, twins, with mild eyes and beautiful hair, who ran about the house, half naked, like a couple of gazelles. They had a brother, somewhat younger, a fine dark boy, with an eye like a woman's. All these were the children of Po Po, begotten in lawful wedlock. Then there were 2 or 3 queer-looking old ladies, who wore shabby mantles of soiled sheeting, which fitted so badly, and withal had such a second-hand look, that I at once put their wearers down as domestic paupers, poor relations, supported by the bounty of my lady Arfriti. They were sad, meek old bodies, said little and ate less, and either kept their eyes on the ground or lifted them up deferentially. The semi-civilization of the island must have had something to do with making them what they were. I had almost forgotten Moni, the grinning old man who prepared our meal. His head was a shining, bald globe. He had a round little paunch and legs like a cat. He was Po Po's factotum, cook, butler, and climber of the breadfruit and cocoanut trees, and, added to all else, a mighty favorite with his mistress, with whom he would sit smoking and gossiping by the hour. Often you saw the indefatigable Moni working away at a great rate, then dropping his employment all at once, never mind what, run off to a little distance, and after rolling himself away in a corner and taking a nap, jump up again and fall to with fresh vigor. From a certain something in the behavior of Po Po and his household, I was led to believe that he was a pillar of the church, though, from what I had seen in Tahiti, I could hardly reconcile such a supposition with his frank, cordial, unembarrassed air. But I was not wrong in my conjecture. Po Po turned out to be a sort of elder or deacon. He was also accounted a man of wealth, and was nearly related to a high chief. Before retiring, the entire household gathered upon the floor, and in their midst he read aloud a chapter from a Tahitian Bible. Then kneeling with the rest of us, he offered up a prayer. Upon its conclusion, all separated without speaking. These devotions took place regularly every night and morning. Grace, too, was invariably said by this family both before and after eating. After becoming familiarized with the almost utter destitution of anything like practical piety upon these islands, what I observed in our host's house astonished me much. But whatever others might have been, Po Po was, in truth, a Christian, the only one, Arfriti excepted, whom I personally knew to be such among all the natives of Polynesia. Chapter 74. Retiring for the Night. The Doctor Grows Devout. They put us to bed very pleasantly. Lying across the foot of Po Po's nuptial couch was a smaller one made of core wood, a thin, strong cord, twisted from the fibers of the husk of the cocoanut, and woven into an exceedingly light sort of network, forming its elastic body. Spread upon this was a single, fine mat, with a roll of dried ferns for a pillow, and a strip of white tappa for a sheet. This couch was mine. The doctor was provided for in another corner. Loo reposed alone on a little settee with a taper burning by her side, the dandy, her brother, swinging overhead in a sailor's hammock. The 2 gazelles frisked upon a mat near by, and the indigent relations borrowed a scant corner of the old butler's pallet, who snored away by the open door. After all had retired, Po Po placed the illuminated melon in the middle of the apartment, and so we all slumbered till morning. Upon waking, the sun was streaming brightly through the open bamboos, but no one was stirring. After surveying the fine attitudes into which forgetfulness had thrown at least one of the sleepers, my attention was called off to the general aspect of the dwelling, which was quite significant of the superior circumstances of our host. The house itself was built in the simple but tasteful native style. It was a long, regular oval, some 50 feet in length, with low sides of cane work, and a roof thatched with palmetto leaves. The ridgepole was, perhaps, 20 feet from the ground. There was no foundation whatever, the bare earth being merely covered with ferns, a kind of carpeting which serves very well if frequently renewed; otherwise it becomes dusty, and the haunt of vermin, as in the huts of the poorer natives. Beside the couches, the furniture consisted of 3 or 4 sailor chests, in which were stored the fine wearing apparel of the household, the ruffled linen shirts of Po Po, the calico dresses of his wife and children, and divers odds and ends of European articles, strings of beads, ribbons, Dutch looking glasses, knives, coarse prints, bunches of keys, bits of crockery, and metal buttons. One of these chests, used as a bandbox by our Friti, contained several of the native hats, coal scuttles, all of the same pattern, but trimmed with variously colored ribbons. Of nothing was our good hostess more proud than of these hats and her dresses. On Sundays she went abroad 12 times, and every time, like Queen Elizabeth, in a different robe. Po Po, for some reason or other, always gave us our meals before the rest of the family were served, and the doctor, who was very discerning in such matters, declared that we fared much better than they. Certain it was, that had Ereemeer's guests travelled with purses, portmanteaus, and letters of introduction to the Queen, they would not have been better cared for. The day after our arrival, Moni, the old butler, brought us in for dinner a small pig, baked in the ground. All savoury, it lay in a wooden trencher, surrounded by roasted hemispheres of the breadfruit. A large calabash filled with taro pudding, or poee, followed; and the young dandy, overcoming his customary languor, threw down our cocoanuts from an adjoining tree. When all was ready, and the household looking on, Long Ghost, devoutly clasping his hands over the fated pig, implored a blessing. Hereupon everybody present looked exceedingly pleased, Po Po coming up and addressing the doctor with much warmth, and our Friti, regarding him with almost maternal affection, exclaimed delightedly, "Ah, Mikoneri Tata Maitai!" in other words, what a pious young man. It was just after this meal that she brought me a roll of grass sinnate, of the kind which sailors sew into the frame of their tarpaulins, and then, handing me a needle and thread, bade me begin at once and make myself the hat which I so much needed. An accomplished hand at the business, I finished it that day, merely stitching the braid together, and our Friti, by way of rewarding my industry, with her own olive hands ornamented the crown with a band of flame-colored ribbon, the 2 long ends of which streaming behind, sailor fashion, still preserved for me the Eastern title bestowed by Long Ghost. End of chapters 73 and 74. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 75 and 76 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 75. A Ramble Through the Settlement. The following morning, making our toilets carefully, we donned our sombreros and sallied out on a tour. Without meaning to reveal our designs upon the court, our principal object was, to learn what chances there were for white men to obtain employment under the Queen. On this head, it is true, we had questioned Po Po, but his answers had been very discouraging, so we determined to obtain further information elsewhere. But first, to give some little description of the village. The settlement of Partoowye is nothing more than some 80 houses, scattered here and there in the midst of an immense grove, where the trees have been thinned out and the underbrush cleared away. Through the grove flows a stream, and the principal avenue crosses it over an elastic bridge of cocoanut trunks laid together side by side. The avenue is broad and serpentine, well shaded from one end to the other, and as pretty a place for a morning promenade as any lounger could wish. The houses, constructed without the slightest regard to the road, peep into view from among the trees on either side, some looking you right in the face as you pass, and others, without any manners, turning their backs. Occasionally, you observe a rural retreat, enclosed by a picket of bamboos, or with a solitary pane of glass massively framed in the broad side of a dwelling. or with a rude, strange-looking door, swinging upon dislocated wooden hinges. Otherwise, the dwellings are built in the original style of the natives, and, never mind how mean and filthy some of them may appear within, they all look picturesque enough without. As we sauntered along, the people we met saluted us pleasantly, and invited us into their houses, and in this way we made a good many brief morning calls. But the hour could not have been the fashionable one in Partoowye, since the ladies were invariably in dishabille. However, they in all cases gave us a cordial reception, and were particularly polite to the doctor, caressing him and amorously hanging about his neck, wonderfully taken up, in short, with a gay handkerchief he wore there. Afriti had that morning bestowed it upon the pious youth. With some exceptions, the general appearance of the natives of Partoowye was far better than that of the inhabitants of Papeetee, a circumstance only to be imputed to their restricted intercourse with foreigners. Strolling on, we turned a sweep of the road when the doctor gave a start, and no wonder. Right before us in the grove was a block of houses, regular square frames, boarded over, furnished with windows and doorways, and 2 stories high. We ran up, and found them fast going to decay, very dingy, and here and there covered with moss, no sashes nor doors, and on one side the entire block had settled down nearly a foot. On going into the basement, we looked up clean through the unboarded timbers to the roof, where rays of light, glimmering through many a chink, illuminated the cobwebs which swung all round. The whole interior was dark and close. Burrowing among some old mats in one corner, like a parcel of gypsies in a ruin, were a few vagabond natives. They had their dwelling here. Curious to know who on earth could have been thus trying to improve the value of real estate in Partoowye, we made inquiries, and learned that some years previous, the block had been thrown up by a veritable Yankee, one might have known that, a house carpenter by trade, and a bold enterprising fellow by nature. Put ashore from his ship, sick, he first went to work and got well, then sallied out with chisel and plane and made himself generally useful. A sober, steady man, it seems, he at last obtained the confidence of several chiefs, and soon filled them with all sorts of ideas concerning the alarming want of public spirit in the people of Eimeo. More especially did he dwell upon the humiliating fact of their living in paltry huts of bamboo, when magnificent palaces of boards might so easily be morticed together. In the end, these representations so far prevailed with one old chief, that the carpenter was engaged to build a batch of these wonderful palaces. Provided with plenty of men, he at once set to work, built a sawmill among the mountains, felled trees, and sent over to Papeetee for nails. Presto! The castle rose, but alas, the roof was hardly on, when the Yankee's patron, having speculated beyond his means, broke all to pieces, and was absolutely unable to pay 1 plug of tobacco in the pound. His failure involved the carpenter, who sailed away from his creditors in the very next ship that touched at the harbor. The natives despised the rickety palace of boards, and often lounged by, wagging their heads and jeering. We were told that the queen's residence was at the extreme end of the village, so, without waiting for the doctor to procure a fiddle, we suddenly resolved upon going thither at once, and learning whether any privy councilorships were vacant. Now, although there was a good deal of my waggish comrade's nonsense about what has been said concerning our expectations of court preferment, we, nevertheless, really thought that something to our advantage might turn up in that quarter. Upon approaching the palace grounds, we found them rather peculiar. A broad pier of hewn coral rocks was built right out into the water, and upon this, and extending into the grove adjoining, were some 8 or 10 very large native houses, constructed in the handsomest style, and enclosed together by a low picket of bamboos, which embraced a considerable area. Throughout the Society Islands, the residences of the chiefs are mostly found in the immediate vicinity of the sea, a site which gives them the full benefit of a cooling breeze, nor are they so liable to the annoyance of insects, besides enjoying when they please the fine shade afforded by the neighboring groves, always most luxuriant near the water. Lounging about the grounds were some 60 or 80 handsomely dressed natives, men and women, some reclining on the shady side of the houses, others under the trees, and a small group conversing close by the railing, facing us. We went up to the latter, and giving the usual salutation, were on the point of vaulting over the bamboos, when they turned upon us angrily and said we could not enter. We stated our earnest desire to see the queen, hinting that we were bearers of important dispatches; but it was to no purpose, and not a little vexed, we were obliged to return to Popo's without effecting anything. Chapter 76. An Island Jilt. We Visit the Ship. Upon arriving home, we fully laid open to Popo our motives in visiting Taloo, and begged his friendly advice. In his broken English, he cheerfully gave us all the information we needed. It was true, he said, that the queen entertained some idea of making a stand against the French, and it was currently reported also that several chiefs from Bora Bora, Huwaini, Raiatea, and Tahar, the leeward islands of the group, were at that very time taking counsel with her as to the expediency of organizing a general movement throughout the entire cluster, with a view of anticipating any further encroachments on the part of the invaders. Should warlike measures be actually decided upon, it was quite certain that Pomaree would be glad to enlist all the foreigners she could. But as to her making officers of either the doctor or me, that was out of the question, because already a number of the Europeans, well known to her, had volunteered as such. Concerning our getting immediate access to the queen, Popo told us it was altogether doubtful. She living at that time very retired, in poor health and spirits, and averse to receiving calls. Previous to her misfortunes, however, no one, however humble, was denied admittance to her presence. Sailors even attended her levees. Not at all disheartened by these things, we concluded to kill time in Partoowye until some event turned up more favorable to our projects. So that very day we sallied out on an excursion to the ship, which, lying landlocked, far up the bay, yet remained to be visited. Passing on our route a long, low shed, a voice hailed us, "White men, ahoy!" Turning round, who should we see but a rosy-cheeked Englishman, you could tell his country at a glance, up to his knees in shavings, and planing away at a bench. He turned out to be a runaway ship's carpenter, recently from Tahiti, and now doing a profitable business in Eimeo, by fitting up the dwellings of opulent chiefs with cupboards and other conveniences, and once in a while trying his hand at a lady's work-box. He had been in the settlement but a few months, and already possessed houses and lands. But though blessed with prosperity and high health, there was one thing wanting, a wife; and when he came to speak of the matter, his countenance fell, and he leaned dejectedly upon his plane. "It's too bad," he sighed, "to wait 3 long years, and all the while dear little Lullee living in the same house with that infernal chief from Tahar." Our curiosity was piqued. The poor carpenter, then, had been falling in love with some island coquette, who was going to jilt him. But such was not the case. There was a law prohibiting, under a heavy penalty, the marriage of a native with a foreigner, unless the latter, after being 3 years a resident on the island, was willing to affirm his settled intention of remaining for life. William was therefore in a sad way. He told us that he might have married the girl half a dozen times, had it not been for this odious law. But latterly, she had become less loving and more giddy, particularly with the strangers from Tahar. Desperately smitten, and desirous of securing her at all hazards, he had proposed to the damsel's friends a nice little arrangement introductory to marriage; but they would not hear of it. Besides, if the pair were discovered living together on such a footing, they would be liable to a degrading punishment, sent to work making stone walls and opening roads for the queen. Dr. Long-Ghost was all sympathy. "Bill, my good fellow," said he tremulously, "let me go and talk to her." But Bill, declining the offer, would not even inform us where his charmer lived. Leaving the disconsolate Willie planing a plank of New Zealand pine, an importation from the Bay of Islands, and thinking the while of Luli, we went on our way. How his suit prospered in the end, we never learned. Going from Popo's house toward the anchorage of the harbor of Taloo, you catch no glimpse of the water until coming out from deep groves, you all at once find yourself upon the beach. A bay, considered by many voyagers the most beautiful in the South Seas, then lies before you. You stand upon one side of what seems a deep, green river flowing through mountain passes to the sea. Right opposite, a majestic promontory divides the inlet from another, called after its discoverer, Captain Cook. The face of this promontory toward Taloo is one verdant wall, and at its base the waters lie still and fathomless. On the left hand, you just catch a peep of the widening mouth of the bay, the break in the reef by which ships enter, and beyond, the sea. To the right, the inlet, sweeping boldly round the promontory, runs far away into the land, where, save in one direction, the hills close in on every side, knee-deep in verdure, and shooting aloft in grotesque peaks. The open space lies at the head of the bay. In the distance it extends into a broad, hazy plain, lying at the foot of an amphitheater of hills. Here is the large sugar plantation previously alluded to. Beyond the first range of hills, you descry the sharp pinnacles of the interior, and among these, the same silent marling-spike, which we so often admired from the other side of the island. All alone in the harbor lay the good ship Leviathan. We jumped into the canoe and paddled off to her. Though early in the afternoon, everything was quiet, but upon mounting the side, we found 4 or 5 sailors lounging about the forecastle under an awning. They gave us no very cordial reception, and though otherwise quite hearty in appearance, seemed to assume a look of ill humor on purpose to honor our arrival. There was much eagerness to learn whether we wanted to ship, and by the unpleasant accounts they gave of the vessel, they seemed desirous to prevent such a thing if possible. We asked where the rest of the ship's company were. A gruff old fellow made answer: "One boat's crew of 'em is gone to Davy Jones's locker. Went off after a whale, last cruise, and never came back again. All the starboard watch ran away last night, and the skipper's ashore kitching 'em." "And it's shipping you're after, my jewels, is it?" cried a curly-pated little Belfast sailor coming up to us. "Then arrah! my livelies, just be after sailing ashore in a jiffy. The devil of a skipper will carry yees both to sea, whether or no. Be off with ye then, darlints, and steer clear of the likes of this ballyhoo of blazes as long as ye live. They murther us here every day, and starve us into the bargain. Here, Dick lad, harl the poor divil's canoe alongside, and paddle away wid yees for dear life." But we loitered awhile, listening to more inducements to ship, and at last concluded to stay to supper. My sheath-knife never cut into a better sea-beef than that which we found lying in the kid in the forecastle. The bread, too, was hard, dry, and brittle as glass, and there was plenty of both. While we were below, the mate of the vessel called out for someone to come on deck. I liked his voice. Hearing it was as good as a look at his face. It betokened a true sailor, and no taskmaster. The appearance of the Leviathan herself was quite pleasing. Like all large, comfortable old whalemen, she had a sort of motherly look, broad in the beam, flush decks, and 4 chubby boats hanging at the breast. Her sails were furled loosely upon the yards, as if they had been worn long and fitted easy. Her shrouds swung negligently slack, and as for the running rigging, it never worked hard as it does in some of your dandy ships, jamming in the sheaves of blocks, like Chinese slippers, too small to be useful. On the contrary, the ropes ran glibly through, as if they had many a time traveled the same road and were used to it. When evening came, we dropped into our canoe and paddled ashore, fully convinced that the good ship never deserved the name which they gave her. End of chapters 75 and 76. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 77 and 78 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 77. A Party of Rovers, Little Lou and the Doctor. While in Partoowye, we fell in with a band of 6 veteran rovers, prowling about the village and harbour, who had just come overland from another part of the island. A few weeks previous, they had been paid off, at Papeetee, from a whaling vessel, on board of which they had, 6 months before, shipped for a single cruise; that is to say, to be discharged at the next port. Their cruise was a famous one, and each man stepped upon the beach at Tahiti, jingling his dollars in a sock. Weary at last of the shore, and having some money left, they clubbed and purchased a sail-boat, proposing a visit to a certain uninhabited island, concerning which they had heard strange and golden stories. Of course, they never could think of going to sea without a medicine chest filled with flasks of spirits, and a small cask of the same in the hold, in case the chest should give out. Away they sailed, hoisted a flag of their own, and gave 3 times 3 as they staggered out of the Bay of Papeetee with a strong breeze, and under all the muslin they could carry. Evening coming on, and feeling in high spirits, and no ways disposed to sleep, they concluded to make a night of it, which they did, all hands getting tipsy, and the 2 masts going over the side about midnight, to the tune of sailing down, on the coast of Barbary. Fortunately, one worthy could stand, by holding on to the tiller; and the rest managed to crawl about, and hack away the lanyards of the rigging, so as to break clear from the fallen spars. While thus employed, 2 sailors got tranquilly over the side, and went plumb to the bottom, under the erroneous impression that they were stepping upon an imaginary wharf, to get at their work better. After this it blew quite a gale, and the Commodore, at the helm, instinctively kept the boat before the wind, and by so doing ran over to the opposite island of Eimeo. Crossing the channel, by almost a miracle they went straight through an opening in the reef, and shot upon a ledge of coral where the waters were tolerably smooth. Here they lay until morning, when the natives came off to them in their canoes. By the help of the islanders, the schooner was hove over on her beam ends, when, finding the bottom knocked to pieces, the adventurers sold the boat for a trifle to the chief of the district, and went ashore, rolling before them their precious cask of spirits. Its contents soon evaporated, and they came to Partoowye. The day after encountering these fellows, we were strolling among the groves in the neighbourhood, when we came across several parties of natives, armed with clumsy muskets, rusty cutlasses, and outlandish clubs. They were beating the bushes, shouting aloud, and apparently trying to scare somebody. They were in pursuit of the strangers, who, having in a single night set at naught all the laws of the place, had thought best to decamp. In the daytime, Popo's house was as pleasant a lounge as one could wish; so after strolling about, and seeing all there was to be seen, we spent the greater part of our mornings there, breakfasting late, and dining about 2 hours after noon. Sometimes we lounged on the floor of ferns, smoking, and telling stories, of which the doctor had as many as a half-pay captain in the army. Sometimes we chatted, as well as we could, with the natives; and one day, joy to us, Popo brought in 3 volumes of Smollett's novels, which had been found in the chest of a sailor who some time previous had died on the island. Amelia! Peregrine! You hero of rogues, Count Fathom! What a debt do we owe you! I know not whether it was the reading of these romances, or the want of some sentimental pastime which led the doctor, about this period, to lay siege to the heart of the little Lou. Now, as I have said before, the daughter of Popo was most cruelly reserved, and never deigned to notice us. Frequently I addressed her with a long face and an air of the profoundest and most distant respect, but in vain; she wouldn't even turn up her pretty olive nose. Ah, it's quite plain, thought I, she knows very well what graceless dogs sailors are, and won't have anything to do with us. But thus thought not my comrade. Bent he was upon firing the cold glitter of Lou's passionless eyes. He opened the campaign with admirable tact, making cautious approaches, and content, for 3 days, with ogling the nymph for about 5 minutes after every meal. On the 4th day he asked her a question. On the 5th she dropped a nut of ointment, and he picked it up and gave it to her. On the 6th he went over and sat down within 3 yards of the couch where she lay, and, on the memorable morn of the 7th, he proceeded to open his batteries in form. The damsel was reclining on the ferns, one hand supporting her cheek, and the other listlessly turning over the leaves of a Tahitian Bible. The doctor approached. Now the chief disadvantage under which he labored was his almost complete ignorance of the love vocabulary of the island. But French counts, they say, make love delightfully in broken English, and what hindered the doctor from doing the same in dulcet Tahitian? So at it he went. "Ah," said he, smiling bewitchingly, "Oe Mickonaree? Oe ready Biblee?" No answer, not even a look. "Ah, my tai, very goody ready Biblee Mickonaree." Loo, without stirring, began reading in a low tone to herself. "Mickonaree Biblee ready goody my tai," once more observed the doctor, ingeniously transposing his words for the 3rd time. But all to no purpose. Loo gave no sign. He paused despairingly, but it would never do to give up, so he threw himself at full length beside her and audaciously commenced turning over the leaves. Loo gave a start, just one little start, barely perceptible, and then, fumbling something in her hand, lay perfectly motionless. The doctor, rather frightened at his own temerity, and knowing not what to do next. At last he placed one arm cautiously about her waist. Almost in the same instant he bounded to his feet with a cry. The little witch had pierced him with a thorn. But there she lay, just as quietly as ever, turning over the leaves and reading to herself. My long friend raised the siege incontinently, and made a disorderly retreat to the place where I reclined, looking on. I am pretty sure that Loo must have related this occurrence to her father, who came in shortly afterward, for he looked queerly at the doctor. But he said nothing, and in 10 minutes was quite affable as ever. As for Loo, there was not the slightest change in her, and the doctor, of course, forever afterwards held his peace. Chapter 78. Mrs. Bell. One day, taking a pensive afternoon stroll along one of the many bridle paths which wind among the shady groves in the neighborhood of Taloo, I was startled by a sunny apparition. It was that of a beautiful young Englishwoman, charmingly dressed, and mounted upon a spirited little white pony. Switching a green branch, she came cantering towards me. I looked round to see whether I could possibly be in Polynesia. There were palm trees, but how to account for the lady? Stepping to one side, as the apparition drew near, I made a polite obeisance. It gave me a bold, rosy look, and then, with a gay air, patted its palfrey, crying out, "Fly away, Willie!" and galloped among the trees. I would have followed, but Willie's heels were making such a pattering among the dry leaves that pursuit would have been useless. So I went straight home to Popo's and related my adventure to the doctor. The next day our inquiries resulted in finding out that the stranger had been in the island about 2 years, that she came from Sydney and was the wife of Mr. Bell, happy dog, the proprietor of the sugar plantation to which I have previously referred. To the sugar plantation we went the same day. The country round about was very beautiful, a level basin of verdure surrounded by sloping hillsides. The sugar cane, of which there was about 100 acres in various stages of cultivation, looked thrifty. A considerable tract of land, however, which seemed to have been formerly tilled, was now abandoned. The place where they extracted the saccharine matter was under an immense shed of bamboos. Here we saw several clumsy pieces of machinery for breaking the cane, also great kettles for boiling the sugar. But at present nothing was going on. 2 or 3 natives were lounging in one of the kettles, smoking. The other was occupied by 3 sailors from the Leviathan, playing cards. While we were conversing with these worthies, a stranger approached. He was a sunburnt, romantic-looking European, dressed in a loose suit of nankeen. His fine throat and chest were exposed, and he sported a Guayaquil hat with a brim like a Chinese umbrella. This was Mr. Bell. He was very civil, showed us the grounds, and, taking us into a sort of arbor, to our surprise, offered to treat us to some wine. People often do the like, but Mr. Bell did more. He produced the bottle. It was spicy sherry, and we drunk out of the halves of fresh citron melons. Delectable goblets. The wine was a purchase from the French in Tahiti. Now all this was extremely polite in Mr. Bell. Still, we came to see Mrs. Bell. But she proved to be a phantom, indeed having left the same morning for Papeete on a visit to one of the missionaries' wives there. I went home much chagrined. To be frank, my curiosity had been wonderfully piqued concerning the lady. In the first place, she was the most beautiful white woman I ever saw in Polynesia. But this is saying nothing. She had such eyes, such moss roses in her cheeks, such a divine air in the saddle, that, to my dying day, I shall never forget Mrs. Bell. The sugar planter himself was young, robust, and handsome. So, merrily may the little bells increase and multiply, and make music in the land of Eimeo. End of chapters 77 and 78. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 79 and 80 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 79. Taloo Chapel, holding court in Polynesia. In Partoowye is to be seen one of the best constructed and handsomest chapels in the South Seas. Like the buildings of the palace, it stands upon an artificial pier, presenting a semicircular sweep to the bay. The chapel is built of hewn blocks of coral, a substance which, although extremely friable, is said to harden by exposure to the atmosphere. To a stranger, these blocks look extremely curious. Their surface is covered with strange fossil-like impressions, the seal of which must have been set before the flood. Very nearly white when hewn from the reef, the coral darkens with age, so that several churches in Polynesia now look almost as sooty and venerable as famed St. Paul's. In shape, the chapel is an octagon, with galleries all round. It will seat perhaps 400 people. Everything within is stained a tawny red, and there being but few windows, or rather embrasures, the dusky benches and galleries, and the tall spectre of the pulpit, look anything but cheerful. On Sundays we always went to worship there. Going in the family suite of Popo, we, of course, maintained a most decorous exterior, and hence, by all the elderly people of the village, were doubtless regarded as pattern young men. Popo's seat was in a snug corner, and it being particularly snug, in the immediate vicinity of one of the palm pillars supporting the gallery, I invariably leaned against it, Popo and his lady on one side, the doctor and the dandy on the other, and the children and the poor relations seated behind. As for Loo, instead of sitting, as she ought to have done, by her good father and mother, she must needs run up into the gallery, and sit with a parcel of giddy creatures of her own age, who, all through the sermon, did nothing but look down on the congregation, pointing out and giggling at the queer-looking old ladies in dowdy bonnets and scant tunics. But Loo herself was never guilty of these improprieties. Occasionally during the week they have afternoon service in the chapel, when the natives themselves have something to say, although their auditors are but few. An introductory prayer being offered by the missionary, and a hymn sung, communicants rise in their places, and exhort in pure Tahitian, and with wonderful tone and gesture. And among them all, Deacon Popo, though he talked most, was the one whom you would have liked best to hear. Much would I have given to have understood some of his impassioned bursts, when he tossed his arms overhead, stamped, scowled, and glared, till he looked like the very angel of vengeance. "Deluded man," sighed the doctor on one of these occasions. "I fear he takes the fanatical view of the subject." One thing was certain. When Popo spoke, all listened. A great deal more than could be said for the rest, for under the discipline of 2 or 3 I could mention, some of the audience napped. Others fidgeted, a few yawned, and one irritable old gentleman in a nightcap of cocoanut leaves used to clutch his long staff in a state of excessive nervousness and stride out of the church, making all the noise he could to emphasize his disgust. Right adjoining the chapel is an immense rickety building with windows and shutters and a half-decayed board flooring laid upon trunks of palm trees. They called it a schoolhouse, but as such we never saw it occupied. It was often used as a courtroom, however, and here we attended several trials, among others that of a decayed naval officer and a young girl of 14, the latter, charged with having been very naughty on a particular occasion, set forth in the pleadings, and the former with having aided and abetted her in her naughtiness, and with other misdemeanors. The foreigner was a tall, military-looking fellow with a dark cheek and black whiskers. According to his own account, he had lost a colonial armed brig on the coast of New Zealand, and since then had been leading the life of a man-about-town among the islands of the Pacific. The doctor wanted to know why he did not go home and report the loss of his brig, but Captain Crash, as they called him, had some incomprehensible reasons for not doing so, about which he could talk by the hour, and no one be any the wiser. Probably he was a discreet man, and thought it best to waive an interview with the Lords of the Admiralty. For some time past this extremely suspicious character had been carrying on an illicit trade in French wines and brandies, smuggled over from the men of war lately touching at Tahiti. In a grove near the anchorage he had a rustic shanty and arbor, where, in quiet times, when no ships were in Taloo, a stray native once in a while got boozy and staggered home, catching at the cocoanut trees as he went. The captain himself lounged under a tree during the warm afternoons, pipe in mouth, thinking perhaps over old times and occasionally feeling his shoulders for his lost epaulets. But, sail ho! A ship is descried coming into the bay. Soon she drops her anchor in its waters, and the next day Captain Crash entertains the sailors in his grove, and rare times they have of it, drinking and quarreling together as sociably as you please. Upon one of these occasions the crew of the Leviathan made so prodigious a tumult that the natives, indignant at the insult offered their laws, plucked up a heart and made a dash at the rioters, 100 strong. The sailors fought like tigers, but were at last overcome and carried before a native tribunal, which, after a mighty clamor, dismissed everybody but Captain Crash, who was asserted to be the author of the disorders. Upon this charge, then, he had been placed in confinement against the coming on of the assizes, the judge being expected to lounge along in the course of the afternoon. While waiting his Honor's arrival, numerous additional offenses were preferred against the culprit, mostly by the old women. Among others was the bit of a slip in which he stood implicated along with the young lady. Thus in Polynesia as elsewhere, charge a man with one misdemeanor, and all his peccadilloes are raked up and assorted before him. Going to the schoolhouse for the purpose of witnessing the trial, the din of it assailed our ears a long way off, and upon entering the building we were almost stunned. About 500 natives were present, each, apparently, having something to say, and determined to say it. His Honor, a handsome, benevolent-looking old man, sat cross-legged on a little platform, seemingly resigned with all Christian submission to the uproar. He was an hereditary chief in this quarter of the island, and judge for life in the district of Partoowye. There were several cases coming on, but the captain and girl were first tried together. They were mixing freely with the crowd, and as it afterward turned out that everyone, no matter who, had a right to address the court, for aught we knew they might have been arguing their own case. At what precise moment the trial began it would be hard to say. There was no swearing of witnesses, and no regular jury. [Footnote: This anomaly exists, notwithstanding that, in other respects, the missionaries have endeavored to organize the native courts upon the English model. End footnote. Now and then somebody leaped up and shouted out something which might have been evidence; the rest, meanwhile, keeping up an incessant jabbering. Presently the old judge himself began to get excited. and, springing to his feet, ran in among the crowd, wagging his tongue as hard as anybody. The tumult lasted about 20 minutes, and toward the end of it Captain Crash might have been seen, tranquilly regarding, from his Honor's platform, the judicial uproar, in which his fate was about being decided. The result of all was this, that both he and the girl were found guilty. The latter was adjudged to make 6 mats for the Queen, and the former, in consideration of his manifold offenses, being deemed incorrigible, was sentenced to eternal banishment from the island. Both these decrees seemed to originate in the general hubbub. His Honor, however, appeared to have considerable authority, and was quite plain that the decision received his approval. The above penalties were by no means indiscriminately inflicted. The missionaries have prepared a sort of penal tariff to facilitate judicial proceedings. It costs so many days' labor on the broom road to indulge in the pleasures of the calabash, so many fathoms of stone wall to steal a musket, and so on to the end of the catalogue. The judge being provided with a book, in which all these matters are cunningly arranged, the thing is vastly convenient. For instance, a crime is proved, say bigamy. Turn to letter B, and there you have it. Bigamy, 40 days on the broom road, and 20 mats for the Queen. Read the passage aloud, and sentence is pronounced. After taking part in the first trial, the other delinquents present were put upon their own, in which also the convicted culprits seemed to have quite as much to say as the rest. A rather strange proceeding, but strictly in accordance with the glorious English principle that every man should be tried by his peers. They were all found guilty. Chapter 80. Queen Pomaree. It is well to learn something about the people before being introduced to them, and so we will here give some account of Pomaree and her family. Every reader of Cook's Voyages must remember Otoo, who, in that navigator's time, was king of the larger peninsula of Tahiti. Subsequently, assisted by the muskets of the Bounty's men, he extended his rule over the entire island. This Otoo, before his death, had his name changed into Pomaree, which has ever since been the royal patronymic. He was succeeded by his son, Pomaree II, the most famous prince in the annals of Tahiti. Though a sad debauchee and drunkard, and even charged with unnatural crimes, he was a great friend of the missionaries, and one of their very first proselytes. During the religious wars into which he was hurried by his zeal for the new faith, he was defeated and expelled from the island. After a short exile, he returned from Eimeo with an army of 800 warriors, and, in the battle of Narai, routed the rebellious pagans with great slaughter, and established himself upon the throne. Thus, by force of arms, was Christianity finally triumphant in Tahiti. Pomaree II, dying in 1821, was succeeded by his infant son under the title of Pomaree III. This young prince survived his father but 6 years, and the government then descended to his older sister, Aimata, the present queen, who is commonly called Pomaree Vahine I, or the first female Pomaree. Her Majesty must be now upwards of 30 years of age. She has been twice married. Her first husband was the son of the old king of Tahar, an island about 100 miles from Tahiti. This proving an unhappy alliance, the pair were soon after divorced. The present husband of the queen is a chief of Eimeo. The reputation of Pomaree is not what it ought to be. She, and also her mother, were, for a long time, excommunicated members of the church, and the former, I believe, still is. Among other things, her conjugal fidelity is far from being unquestioned. Indeed, it was upon this ground chiefly that she was excluded from the communion of the church. Previous to her misfortunes, she spent the greater portion of her time sailing about from one island to another, attended by a licentious court, and wherever she went, all manner of games and festivities celebrated her arrival. She was always given to display. For several years the maintenance of a regiment of household troops drew largely upon the royal exchequer. They were trouserless fellows, in a uniform of calico shirts and pasteboard hats, armed with muskets of all shapes and calibers, and commanded by a great noisy chief, strutting it in a coat of fiery red. These heroes escorted their mistress whenever she went abroad. Some time ago, the Queen received from her English sister, Victoria, a very showy, though uneasy, head-dress, a crown, probably made to order at some tinman's in London. Having no idea of reserving so pretty a bauble for coronation days, which comes so seldom, Her Majesty sported it whenever she appeared in public, and, to show her familiarity with European customs, politely touched it to all foreigners of distinction, whaling captains and the like, whom she happened to meet in her evening walk on the Broom Road. The arrival and departure of royalty were always announced at the palace by the court artilleryman, a fat old gentleman, who, in a prodigious hurry and perspiration, discharged minute fowling pieces as fast as he could load and fire the same. The Tahitian princess leads her husband a hard life. Poor fellow! He not only caught a queen, but a Tartar when he married her. The style by which he is addressed is rather significant: Pomaree Tanee, Pomaree's man. All things considered, as appropriate a title for a king consort as could be hit upon. If ever there was a henpecked husband, that man is the prince. One day, his cara sposa, giving audience to a deputation from the captains of the vessels lying in Papeete, he ventured to make a suggestion which was very displeasing to her. She turned round, and, boxing his ears, told him to go over to his beggarly island of Eimeo if he wanted to give himself airs. Cuffed and condemned, poor Tanee flies to the bottle, or rather to the calabash, for solace. Like his wife and mistress, he drinks more than he ought. 6 or 7 years ago, when an American man-of-war was lying at Papeete, the town was thrown into the greatest commotion by a conjugal assault and battery, made upon the sacred person of Pomaree by her intoxicated Tanee. Captain Bob once told me the story, and by way of throwing more spirit into the description, as well as to make up for his oral deficiencies, the old man went through the accompanying action, myself being proxy for the Queen of Tahiti. It seems that on a Sunday morning, being dismissed contemptuously from the royal presence, Tanee was accosted by certain good fellows, friends and boon companions, who condoled with him on his misfortunes, railed against the Queen, and finally dragged him away to an illicit vendor of spirits, in whose house the party got gloriously mellow. In this state, Pomaree Vahinee I was the topic upon which all dilated. A vixen of a queen probably suggested one. "It's infamous," said another. "And I'd have satisfaction," cried a third. "And so I will," Tanee must have hiccoughed, for off he went, and ascertaining that his royal half was out riding, he mounted his horse and galloped after her. Near the outskirts of the town a cavalcade of women came cantering towards him, in the center of which was the object of his fury. Smiting his beast right and left, he dashed in among them, completely overturning one of the party, leaving her on the field, and dispersing everybody else except Pomaree. Backing her horse dexterously, the incensed queen heaped upon him every scandalous epithet she could think of, until at last the enraged Tanee leaped out of his saddle, caught Pomaree by her dress, and dragging her to the earth, struck her repeatedly in the face, holding on meanwhile by the hair of her head. He was proceeding to strangle her on the spot, when the cries of the frightened attendants brought a crowd of natives to the rescue, who bore the nearly insensible queen away. But his frantic rage was not yet sated. He ran to the palace, and before it could be prevented, demolished a valuable supply of crockery, a recent present from abroad. In the act of perpetrating some other atrocity, he was seized from behind, and carried off with rolling eyes and foaming at the mouth. This is a fair example of a Tahitian in a passion. Though the mildest of mortals in general, and hard to be roused, when once fairly up, he is possessed with 1,000 devils. The day following, Tanee was privately paddled over to Eimeo in a canoe, where, after remaining in banishment for a couple of weeks, he was allowed to return, and once more give in his domestic adhesion. Though Pomaree Vahinee I be something of a Jezebel in private life, in her public rule she is said to have been quite lenient and forbearing. This was her true policy. For an hereditary hostility to her family had always lurked in the hearts of many powerful chiefs, the descendants of the old kings of Taiarbu, dethroned by her grandfather Otoo. Chief among these, and in fact the leader of his party, was Pufai, a bold, able man, who made no secret of his enmity to the missionaries and the government which they controlled. But while events were occurring, calculated to favor the hopes of the disaffected and turbulent, the arrival of the French gave a most unexpected turn to affairs. During my sojourn in Tahiti, a report was rife, which I knew to originate with what is generally called the missionary party, that Pufai and some of the other chiefs of note had actually agreed, for a stipulated bribe, to acquiesce in the appropriation of their country. But subsequent events have rebutted the calumny. Several of these very men have recently died in battle against the French. Under the sovereignty of the Pomarees, the great chiefs of Tahiti were something like the barons of King John, holding feudal sway over their patrimonial valleys, and, on account of their descent, warmly beloved by the people, they frequently cut off the royal revenues by refusing to pay the customary tribute due from them as vassals. The truth is that with the ascendancy of the missionaries, the regal office in Tahiti lost much of its dignity and influence. In the days of paganism, it was supported by all the power of a numerous priesthood, and was solemnly connected with the entire superstitious idolatry of the island. The monarch claimed to be a sort of byblow of Tararoa, the Saturn of the Polynesian mythology, and cousin german to inferior deities. His person was thrice holy. If he entered an ordinary dwelling, never mind for how short a time, it was demolished when he left, no common mortal being thought worthy to inhabit it afterwards. "I'm a greater man than King George," said the incorrigible young Otoo to the first missionaries. "He rides on a horse, and I on a man." Such was the case. He traveled post through his dominions on the shoulders of his subjects, and relays of immortal beings were provided in all the valleys. But alas, how times have changed! How transient human greatness! Some years since, Pomaree Vahini I, the granddaughter of the proud Otoo, went into the laundry business, publicly soliciting, by her agents, the washing of the linen belonging to the officers of ships touching in her harbors. It is a significant fact, and one worthy of record, that while the influence of the English missionaries at Tahiti has tended to so great a diminution of the regal dignity there, that of the American missionaries at the Sandwich Islands has been purposely exerted to bring about a contrary result. End of chapters 79 and 80. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 81 and 82 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 81. We visit the court. It was about the middle of the second month of the Hegira, and therefore some 5 weeks after our arrival in Partoowye, that we at last obtained admittance to the residence of the Queen. It happened thus. There was a Marquesan in the train of Pomaree, who officiated as nurse to her children. According to the Tahitian custom, the royal youngsters are carried about until it requires no small degree of strength to stand up under them. But Marbona was just the man for this, large and muscular, well made as a statue, and with an arm like a degenerate Tahitian's thigh. Embarking at his native island as a sailor, on board of a French whaler, he afterwards ran away from the ship at Tahiti, where, being seen and admired by Pomaree, he had been prevailed upon to enlist in her service. Often, when visiting the grounds, we saw him walking about in the shade, carrying 2 handsome boys, who encircled his neck with their arms. Marbona's face, tattooed as it was in the ornate style of his tribe, was as good as a picture book to these young Pomarees. They delighted to trace with their fingers the outlines of the strange shapes there delineated. The first time my eyes lighted upon the Marquesan, I knew his country in a moment, and hailing him in his own language, he turned round, surprised that a person so speaking should be a stranger. He proved to be a native of Taior, a glen of Nuku Hiva. I had visited the place more than once, and so, on the island of Eimeo, we met like old friends. In my frequent conversations with him over the bamboo picket, I found this islander a philosopher of nature, a wild heathen, moralizing upon the vices and follies of the Christian court of Tahiti; a savage, scorning the degeneracy of the people among whom fortune had thrown him. I was amazed at the national feelings of the man. No European, when abroad, could speak of his country with more pride than Marbona. He assured me again and again that so soon as he had obtained sufficient money to purchase 20 muskets and as many bags of powder, he was going to return to a place with which Eimeo was not worthy to be compared. It was Marbona who, after 1 or 2 unsuccessful attempts, at last brought about our admission into the Queen's grounds. Through a considerable crowd, he conducted us along the pier to where an old man was sitting, to whom he introduced us as a couple of Karhouris of his acquaintance, anxious to see the sights of the palace. The venerable chamberlain stared at us and shook his head. The doctor, thinking he wanted a fee, placed a plug of tobacco in his hand. This was ingratiating, and we were permitted to pass on. Upon the point of entering one of the houses, Marbona's name was shouted in half a dozen different directions, and he was obliged to withdraw. Thus left at the very threshold to shift for ourselves, my companion's assurance stood us in good stead. He stalked right in, and I followed. The place was full of women, who, instead of exhibiting the surprise we expected, accosted us as cordially as if we had called to make our souchong with them by express invitation. In the first place, nothing would do but we must each devour a calabash of poee and several roasted bananas. Pipes were then lighted, and a brisk conversation ensued. These ladies of the court, if not very polished, were surprisingly free and easy in their manners, quite as much so as King Charles's beauties. There was one of them, an arch little miss, who could converse with us pretty fluently, to whom we strove to make ourselves particularly agreeable with the view of engaging her services as cicerone. As such, she turned out to be everything we could desire. No one disputing her will, every place was entered without ceremony, curtains brushed aside, mats lifted, and each nook and corner explored. Whether the little damsel carried her mistress's signet, that everything opened to her thus, I know not, but Marbona himself, the bearer of infants, could not have been half so serviceable. Among other houses which we visited was one of large size and fine exterior, the special residence of a European, formerly the mate of a merchant vessel, who had done himself the honour of marrying into the Pomaree family. The lady he wedded being a near kinswoman of the Queen, he became a permanent member of Her Majesty's household. This adventurer rose late, dressed theatrically in calico and trinkets, assumed a dictatorial tone in conversation, and was evidently upon excellent terms with himself. We found him reclining on a mat, smoking a reed pipe of tobacco, in the midst of an admiring circle of chiefs and ladies. He must have noticed our approach, but instead of rising and offering civilities, he went on talking and smoking without even condescending to look at us. "His Highness feels his poee," carelessly observed the doctor. The rest of the company gave us the ordinary salutation, our guide announcing us beforehand. In answer to our earnest requests to see the Queen, we were now conducted to an edifice, by far the most spacious in the enclosure. It was at least 150 feet in length, very wide, with low eaves, and an exceedingly steep roof of pandanus leaves. There were neither doors nor windows, nothing along the sides but the slight posts supporting the rafters. Between these posts, curtains of fine matting and tappa were rustling all round. Some of them were festooned, or partly withdrawn, so as to admit light and air, and afford a glimpse now and then of what was going on within. Pushing aside one of the screens, we entered. The apartment was one immense hall, the long and lofty ridgepole fluttering with fringed matting and tassels, full 40 feet from the ground. Lounges of mats, piled one upon another, extended on either side; while here and there were slight screens, forming as many recesses, where groups of natives, all females, were reclining at their evening meal. As we advanced, these various parties ceased their buzzing, and in explanation of our appearance among them, listened to a few cabalistic words from our guide. The whole scene was a strange one, but what most excited our surprise was the incongruous assemblage of the most costly objects from all quarters of the globe. Cheek by jowl, they lay beside the rudest native articles without the slightest attempt at order. Superb writing desks of rosewood, inlaid with silver and mother-of-pearl, decanters and goblets of cut glass, embossed volumes of plates, gilded candelabras, sets of globes and mathematical instruments, the finest porcelain, richly mounted sabers and fowling pieces, laced hats and sumptuous garments of all sorts, with numerous other matters of European manufacture, were strewn about among greasy calabashes half filled with poee, rolls of old tappa and matting, paddles and fish spears, and the ordinary furniture of a Tahitian dwelling. All the articles first mentioned were, doubtless, presents from foreign powers. They were more or less injured. The fowling pieces and swords were rusted, the finest woods were scratched, and a folio volume of Hogarth lay open, with a cocoanut shell of some musty preparation capsized among the miscellaneous furniture of the rake's apartment, where that inconsiderate young gentleman is being measured for a coat. While we were amusing ourselves in this museum of curiosities, our conductor plucked us by the sleeve and whispered, "Pomaree, Pomaree, are my cow-cow." "She is coming to sup, then," said the doctor, staring in the direction indicated. "What say you, Paul, suppose we step up?" Just then a curtain near by lifted, and from a private building a few yards distant the Queen entered, unattended. She wore a loose gown of blue silk, with two rich shawls, one red and the other yellow, tied about her neck. Her Royal Majesty was barefooted. She was about the ordinary size, rather matronly; her features not very handsome; her mouth voluptuous; but there was a careworn expression in her face, probably attributed to her late misfortunes. From her appearance, one would judge her about 40, but she is not so old. As the Queen approached one of the recesses, her attendants hurried up, escorted her in, and smoothed the mats on which she at last reclined. Two girls soon appeared, carrying their mistress's repast; and then, surrounded by cut glass and porcelain, and jars of sweetmeats and confections, Pomaree Vahinee I, the titular Queen of Tahiti, ate fish and poee out of her native calabashes, disdaining either knife or spoon. "Come on," whispered Long Ghost, "let's have an audience at once." And he was on the point of introducing himself, when our guide, quite alarmed, held him back, and implored silence. The other natives also interfered, and as he was pressing forward, raised such an outcry that Pomaree lifted her eyes and saw us for the first. She seemed surprised and offended, and issuing an order in a commanding tone to several of her women, waved us out of the house. Summary as the dismissal was, court etiquette, no doubt, required our compliance. We withdrew, making a profound inclination as we disappeared behind the tappa eras. We departed the grounds without seeking Marbona, and previous to vaulting over the picket, fed our pretty guide after a fashion of our own. Looking round a few moments after, we saw the damsel escorted back by two men, who seemed to have been sent after her. I trust she received nothing more than a reprimand. The next day Po Po informed us that strict orders had been issued to admit no strangers within the palace precincts. Chapter 81, which ends the book. Disappointed in going to court, we determined upon going to sea. It would never do longer to trespass on Po Po's hospitality, and then, weary somewhat of life in Eimeo, like all sailors ashore, I at last pined for the billows. Now, if her crew were to be credited, the Leviathan was not the craft to our mind. But I had seen the captain, and liked him. He was an uncommonly tall, robust, fine-looking man, in the prime of life. There was a deep crimson spot in the middle of each sunburnt cheek, doubtless the effect of his sea potations. He was a vineyarder, or native of the island of Martha's Vineyard, adjoining Nantucket, and, I would have sworn it, a sailor and no tyrant. Previous to this, we had rather avoided the Leviathan's men when they came ashore, but now we purposely threw ourselves in their way in order to learn more of the vessel. We became acquainted with a third mate, a Prussian, and an old merchant seaman. A right jolly fellow, with a face like a ruby. We took him to Popo's, and gave him a dinner of baked pig and breadfruit, with pipes and tobacco for dessert. The account he gave us of the ship agreed with my own surmises. A cozier old craft never floated, and the captain was the finest man in the world. There was plenty to eat, too, and, at sea, nothing to do but sit on the windlass and sail. The only bad trait about the vessel was this: she had been launched under some baleful star, and so was a luckless ship in the fishery. She dropped her boats into the brine often enough, and they frequently got fast to the whales, but lance and harpoon almost invariably drew when darted by the men of the Leviathan. But what of that? We would have all the sport of chasing the monsters, with none of the detestable work which follows their capture. So, hurrah for the coast of Japan! Thither the ship was bound. A word now about the hard stories we heard the first time we visited the ship. They were nothing but idle fictions, got up by the sailors for the purpose of frightening us away, so as to oblige the captain, who was in want of more hands, to lie the longer in a pleasant harbor. The next time the Vineyarder came ashore, we flung ourselves in his path. When informed of our desire to sail with him, he wanted to know our history, and above all, what countrymen we were. We said that we had left a whaler in Tahiti some time previous, and, since then, had been, in the most praiseworthy manner, employed upon a plantation. As for our country, sailors belonged to no nation in particular. We were, on this occasion, both Yankees. Upon this, he looked decidedly incredulous, and freely told us that he verily believed we were both from Sydney. Be it known here that American sea captains in the Pacific are mortally afraid of these Sydney gentry, who, to tell the truth, wherever known, are in excessively bad odor. Is there a mutiny on board a ship in the South Seas? 10 to 1 a Sydney man is the ringleader. Ashore, these fellows are equally riotous. It was on this account that we were anxious to conceal the fact of our having belonged to the Julia, though it annoyed me much, thus to deny the dashing little craft. For the same reason, also, the doctor fibbed about his birthplace. Unfortunately, one part of our raiment, our Frites blue frocks, was deemed a sort of collateral evidence against us; for, curiously enough, an American sailor is generally distinguished by his red frock, and an English tar by his blue one, thus reversing the national colors. The circumstance was pointed out by the captain, and we quickly explained the anomaly; but in vain. He seemed inveterately prejudiced against us, and, in particular, eyed the doctor most distrustfully. By way of propping the latter's pretensions, I was throwing out a hint concerning Kentucky as a land of tall men, when our Vineyarder turned away abruptly, and desired to hear nothing more. It was evident that he took Long Ghost for an exceedingly problematical character. Perceiving this, I resolved to see what a private interview would do. So, one afternoon, I found the captain smoking a pipe in the dwelling of a portly old native, one Mai, who for a reasonable compensation did the honors of Partoowye to illustrious strangers. His guest had just risen from a sumptuous meal of baked pig and taro pudding, and the remnants of the repast were still visible. 2 reeking bottles also, with their necks wrenched off, lay upon the mat. All this was encouraging; for, after a good dinner, one feels affluent and amiable, and particularly open to conviction. So, at all events, I found the noble Vineyarder. I began by saying that I called for the purpose of setting him right, touching certain opinions of his concerning the place of my nativity. I was an American, thank heaven, and wanted to convince him of the fact. After looking me in the eye for some time, and, by so doing, revealing an obvious unsteadiness in his own visual organs, he begged me to reach forth my arm. I did so, wondering what upon earth that useful member had to do with the matter in hand. He placed his fingers upon my wrist, and, holding them there for a moment, sprang to his feet, and, with much enthusiasm, pronounced me a Yankee every beat of my pulse. "Here, my," he cried, "another bottle!" And when it came, with one stroke of a knife he summarily beheaded it, and commanded me to drain it to the bottom. He then told me that if I would come on board his vessel the following morning I would find the ship's articles on the cabin transom. This was getting along famously, but what was to become of the doctor? I forthwith made an adroit allusion to my long friend, but it was worse than useless. The vineyarder swore he would have nothing to do with him. He, my long friend, was a bird from Sydney, and nothing would make him, the man of little faith, believe otherwise. I could not help loving the free-hearted captain, but indignant at this most unaccountable prejudice against my comrade, I abruptly took leave. Upon informing the doctor of the result of the interview, he was greatly amused, and laughingly declared that the vineyarder must be a penetrating fellow. He then insisted upon my going to sea in the ship, since he well knew how anxious I was to leave. As for himself, on second thoughts, he was no sailor, and although landsmen very often compose part of a whaler's crew, he did not quite relish the idea of occupying a position so humble. In short, he had made up his mind to tarry a while in Eimeo. I turned the matter over, and at last decided upon quitting the island. The impulse urging me to sea once more, and the prospect of eventually reaching home, were too much to be resisted, especially as the Leviathan was so comfortable a craft, was now bound on her last whaling cruise, and, in little more than a year's time, would be going round Cape Horn. I did not, however, covenant to remain in the vessel for the residue of the voyage, which would have been needlessly binding myself. I merely stipulated for the coming cruise, leaving my subsequent movements unrestrained, for there is no knowing that I might not change my mind and prefer journeying home by short and easy stages. The next day I paddled off to the ship, signed and sealed, and stepped ashore with my advance, 15 Spanish dollars, tasseling the ends of my neck handkerchief. I forced half of the silver on Long Ghost, and having little use for the remainder, would have given it to Po-Po as some small return for his kindness. But although he well knew the value of the coin, not a dollar would he accept. In 3 days' time, the Prussian came to Po-Po's and told us that the captain, having made good the number of his crew by shipping several islanders, had determined upon sailing with the land breeze at dawn the following morning. These tidings were received in the afternoon. The doctor immediately disappeared, returning soon after with a couple of flasks of wine concealed in the folds of his frock. Through the agency of the Marquesan, he had purchased them from an understrapper of the court. I prevailed upon Po-Po to drink a parting shell, and even little Loo, actually looking conscious that one of her hopeless admirers was about leaving Partoowye forever, sipped a few drops from a folded leaf. As for the warm-hearted Arfriti, her grief was unbounded. She even besought me to spend my last night under her own palm thatch, and then, in the morning, she would herself paddle me off to the ship. But this I would not consent to, and so, as something to remember her by, she presented me with a roll of fine matting and another of tappa. These gifts, placed in my hammock, I afterwards found very agreeable in the warm latitudes to which we were bound. Nor did they fail to awaken most grateful remembrances. About nightfall we broke away from this generous-hearted household and hurried down to the water. It was a mad, merry night among the sailors. They had on tap a small cask of wine, procured in the same way as the doctor's flasks. An hour or two after midnight everything was noiseless, but when the first streak of the dawn showed itself over the mountains, a sharp voice hailed the forecastle and ordered the ship unmoored. The anchors came up cheerily, the sails were soon set, and with the early breath of the tropical morning, fresh and fragrant from the hillsides, we slowly glided down the bay and were swept through the opening in the reef. Presently we hove to, and the canoes came alongside to take off the islanders who had accompanied us thus far. As he stepped over the side, I shook the doctor long and heartily by the hand. I have never seen or heard of him since. Crowding all sail, we braced the yards square, and, the breeze freshening, bowled straight away from the land. Once more the sailor's cradle rocked under me, and I found myself rolling in my gait. By noon the island had gone down in the horizon, and all before us was the wide Pacific. End of chapters 81 and 82. Recording by Trisha G. End of Omoo, A Narrative of Adventures in the South Seas by Herman Melville.